Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I had the chance to talk to a longstanding colleague, Saul Permutter, who won the Nobel Prize in 2011 for his contributions to the discovery of something near and dear to me, the fact that the expansion of the universe is accelerating, and the apparent fact that the dominant energy of the universe resides in empty space. This was a fun discussion because it wasn't just about Saul's own scientific background and history, which we covered at the beginning, but in fact, I wanted to focus on this because of a new book that he wrote. And that new book is a collaborative effort with two other colleagues, a psychologist and a philosopher, called Third Millennium Thinking. And it's really about how scientific thinking can be important in affecting the way we think about the world. Obviously, a subject I've talked a lot about in this podcast and in my own work. But we had a great discussion of his own background and the many tools that scientists, that the people can use from science to make the world a better place, and also the limitations of those tools. And it was a really enjoyable discussion, including a frank discussion of some of his own work and some of my work and how that fit in. I think listeners who want to learn more about science and about Saul's science, but about the importance of science in the world, will really benefit from listening to this discussion, which I really enjoyed, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack site, and subscriptions to that site, paid subscriptions, will go to supporting the Origins Project Foundation, which produces this podcast. Or you can watch it or listen to it on our YouTube channel, or listen to it on any podcast listening site. And no matter how you listen to it or watch it, I hope you'll enjoy it, and I hope you'll consider supporting the foundation. So with no further ado, Saul Permutter. Well, Saul, thanks so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it. It's been a long time since I've been with you in person, but we go back a long way, and so it's nice to see you again.
It's nice to be here with you.
Yeah, well, and it's fun to not just talk about you, but this new book that you've co-written with fellow colleagues, which I feel obliged to show, Third Millennium Thinking, and we'll get to that. And it's a wonderful read, and not least because I agreed with almost everything in it. But we'll get there. But as you may or may not know, this is an Origins podcast, and I want to begin therefore with your origins. I always like to know how people got to where the point that we want to begin, to the point in this case of the book or your work. So I want to begin, and it's always fun for me to learn about, especially for people I've known a long time like you, where I get to now learn more about your origins, which I learned about, interestingly enough. Your father was a professor of engineering, is that correct?
That's right.
And your mother was a professor of too, but I didn't quite like administration. What does that mean?
So it's a branch of social work, and it's the area, where as you go from caseworking individually to actually administrating programs, they study what works, what doesn't work, and what people learn about it.
So you obviously grew up in an academic household. Also, were your parents? I noticed that one of your grandparents taught Yiddish. Is that right?
That's right. So
Did your
in fact,
parents speak?
that's
What?
right. All four grandparents, that was probably one of their first language. And my parents both knew Yiddish growing up. Although I think they mostly used it for us as a secret language to tell when should the kids go to sleep.
Yeah, that's right. My parents spoke Yiddish, and I learned German, hoping when I was a student, hoping I would understand when they were having their secret conversations. But needless to say, they didn't teach you Yiddish then, did they?
Well, we got sent to a Sunday school, which was there's a Yiddish culture movement that was very non-religious,
Yeah.
and probably fairly strongly non-religious, but very strongly cultural. And so we were taught Yiddish. We were not taught Hebrew actually in the
Interesting.
Sunday school. So.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
So
there was a short period in which I actually could carry on a reasonably simple
conversation.
conversation in Yiddish, and I can still read. But most of it I don't have.
Oh, that's great. You can read it. I just know the standard words that we learn, a few of them, and that are useful. Um, Now, but Yiddish, as you just point out, speaking Yiddish and being religious are not necessarily the same thing. Was it a religious household? Were your parents religious? Were they?
Oh, no, all four grandparents were I think relatively strongly anti-religious. I think I mean mostly I think it was a period in which a lot of sort of the Enlightenment ideals were coming through in that part of the world, and I think these were people who all were planning to move to this new world, new country, and I think they had this free thinking style that for my sense is that it was actually relatively widespread, and at least there's a very big community that then showed up in places like Philadelphia and New York that probably shared that style.
Ah, interesting. And obviously, then your parents shared that.
Exactly,
You
that's
did
right.
go to Sunday school. You didn't? Were you bar mitzvahed?
I was, but in a secular ceremony that they it was all seen as a cultural activity. So we wrote we
Okay.
wrote a talk about a socially relevant topic. We sang songs, and so it was definitely a whole different experience than those friends of mine who grew up in a more traditional Jewish synagogue environment.
Yeah, well, I went and I was the latter, and I wish I'd had been the former because maybe I wouldn't have reacted so negatively to the whole experience. But did you not that it matters? Were your parents were they atheists or agnostic? Did that issue ever come up or
It was not actually a major topic of conversation, but I would guess, and I would say that they would probably think that atheism was sort of the obvious default.
the
I
norm?
think I,
Yeah,
it probably
yeah.
didn't it probably didn't even occur to them to discuss it because it seemed so clear as to that culture.
Yeah, no, you make up an important point, which I've talked about otherwise. A lot of people seem to think this God thing is really important in science. I don't call myself an atheist anymore as much as an apatheist because people don't realize that the question, you and I both been scientists for over 40 years and I've never been to a scientific meeting and ever heard the word God discussed at all. So it just doesn't come in. It's just irrelevant to our understanding. So we don't even think about the question.
I mean, one way that I sometimes describe this to people is I say, okay, so the problem is that if you were trying to figure out what, like in our case, we both work in these areas of cosmology where
Yeah.
the origin of the universe, the Big Bang obviously comes up a lot, and so people say, well, doesn't that tell you something about God? And I say the problem is that if it told you anything about God, then you'd want to know more. That it wouldn't answer any of the questions if you just said, well, this was all the creation of God. It doesn't help because you then want to know, okay, well, did God have other options? Could he have done something different? Did he have to work within rules of physics, or could he make up the rules of physics? And if so, how does he make it up? How does this stuff work, right? And so it doesn't really address the questions that the scientists and for that matter, most people in the end care about. It just puts them into a different context.
Really a good point. In fact, and Einstein unfortunately gets quoted because he didn't believe in a kind of God that the canonical kind. But he often said, "What most interests me," and this, by the way, is probably what most interests me too, is he said the question of God had any choice in the creation of the universe, which for physicists like you and me, the question you just raised, could there be other kinds of universes with different laws of physics, or do they have to be the kind we live in today? And of course, the work you've done is important in that regard, and I've spent a lot of time on it as well. It's thinking about whether it means that our universe is just a cosmic accident, which I think is probably what most theorists think quietly right now, which is quite different from when you and I were younger. I became a scientist because I wanted to know why the universe had to be the way it was. And the answer may be, well, that's just an accident. But anyway, we will get there.
Yeah,
But
yeah, no, and of course that's still one of the now that's become one of the interesting debates, as to whether
exactly,
that's
exactly. And so, but I think the key point is that, well, and I wasn't even going to go here yet, but the key point in cosmology is that it hasn't that there's no evidence of anything, the need for anything beyond the laws of physics to get where we are now. And it's kind of amazing that using the known laws of physics, we can understand plausibly the history of the universe right back from well before the first second of the universe to now. That is an amazing, amazing result, which we should celebrate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, at the same time, I always, when sometimes when I get asked some of these questions, I always feel like it's important to, at the same time, say that that doesn't at all address the human need for understanding meaning in the world, right? And so that all that could be true, and all that could be things that we will almost take axiomatically, for what we're doing
Yeah.
as scientists. But it doesn't answer the question that people are, in some sense, really asking for. That people want to know, well, where do we find meaning? In this world that we live in, and for many people, of course, the key element of the religion is that it actually allows them to live in the world in a in a comfortable, thoughtful way. And I always feel like I don't want to take that away from anybody, just because it doesn't happen to be the way I reach for meaning. And so
Yeah.
there's this funny sense in which people sometimes feel like it's a possible conflict that I
Yeah.
feel is it almost misses the main point, which is that people want both things. They want to understand the the facts of the world, but they also want to understand where does our meaning come from, and those, in some sense, they were originally both done through some of these religions, in not every religion, but many religions, and so I don't, in some sense, I don't want to undercut that need that people have, which both those needs are there.
Absolutely. I mean, if religion didn't fulfill that kind of need, it wouldn't be so ubiquitous in human experience. Since every culture has them, and people have searched for meaning, and and for and I, for people like me, I'm happy that to think we make our own meaning. But um, exactly. But it's actually extremely interesting you point this out, because near the end of our conversation, we'll get to this, because the book is about something that I've spent my life doing, which is trying to teach people how to think like scientists, because I think it's important for our society. And obviously, that's what the book is largely about. But at the end of it, of course, we talk about values versus science. And we'll get there. We'll get there. And how many hours it takes us, we'll see. But we'll get there. And so we'll come back to this question of meaning at the end. So it's a nice circle to have. But I often say that, if I looked up at the sky tonight and the stars have rearranged themselves to say, either in English or Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever, or Greek, I am here. Well, then I might think cosmology was telling us something that it isn't right now. So
But
so
even then, you immediately go to the question of how do we do that?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I'd ask the question, but I'd be willing to be more open to the fact that maybe we had to go beyond just the known four forces of nature. In
Yes.
any case, okay, good. Well, I've gone far away, but let's come back to you again. Um, your your mother was background in social work, your father in engineering, an academic household, and you were a nice Jewish boy. Your parents wanted you to be, I assume, a professional, but unlike my parents, they didn't care if you became a doctor or a lawyer, I assume.
I think that's true. I think they both grew up, of course, in immigrant families,
Yeah.
which were relatively, well, very poor in some cases. And so for them, getting educated was actually part of entering into a functioning economic world, where,
Yeah.
where they could actually make a living as well. So I think there's a little bit of the first generation need to know, are the children going to be okay? Are they going to be
Yeah.
able to
Mhm.
find jobs? So I remember that as a student, as an undergraduate, I was looking at physics. I was also looking at philosophy, but I ended up being a physics major. And my parents, were reading the articles at that time in the newspaper describing how physicists were having a hard time finding employment.
Yeah.
And so they were asking, have I considered like taking some engineering, along the way, because you know
Mm.
engineers always eventually get employed. At least that was the feeling. And so I remember at the time saying to them, at the end, I think that I will probably be able to make a living, and I will probably make a better living doing something that I'm really personally invested in, personally excited by. And so
Of
that was,
course.
and I think they understood that, and they did. But you're right, that was the kind of thing where I think parents who were living in that slightly academic, well, in a very academic and professional world, they would be looking and be more open to different ways you could do that.
Absolutely, yeah. They're much more, yeah. Unlike my parents didn't graduate high school, so they didn't quite understand the issue. For them, a professional and education was doctor or lawyer. But
Right.
the interesting. I wonder whether your father might push you more towards engineering than physics. Because when I was chair of a physics department, I had that a lot when we were talking to students who were choosing, and we actually created an engineering physics degree,
Yeah.
partly in response to that, because you know we would say that the best part of of engineering is learning about physics, is learning how to solve problems. And interestingly enough, what I learned in the process of that was that most physicists outside of academia who get employed are called engineers, or basic. So they don't have to have an engineering degree. You can be basically employed as an engineer with a physics degree. And I would always say that's a better route, but that was just obviously a prejudice. But
And of course, the equivalent of that nowadays is that almost any one of my students ends up being a highly trained data scientist
yeah, of
in
course,
the end of the day. And of course, that's in some ways they can get jobs there more easily than almost any other training, because people
yeah.
recognize that the physicists tend to come with this extra ability to think about the problems as well as the computer programming. It's
Yeah,
just
as well as learning the numerical techniques. Yeah, I mean, one year when I taught at Yale, every one of our PhD graduates went to Wall Street and did a good living. But beyond caring about whether you did a profession, I wonder where your interest in science came from. Was it your father? Was it your mother? Was it reading? Was it an uncle? Or was it good teachers? So I'm always interested in where people got that kind of
Yeah,
interest.
no, interesting. I think for me, it was a mix of of a wide variety of those things you described. I mean, I think I was just one of the kids who just was always curious, about
Yeah,
how things work. And I think to some extent, I was always curious about all the different sort of languages. In I say languages, but I mean in any sense of the word, languages of the
yeah.
world, including the languages of physics, the languages of I mean different people in different cultures, but also the languages of different fields. How did people describe their areas? And I think in some sense, physics is sort of the ultimate of getting down below all this. I mean, that you want to know, where does this all come from? And I think that was, in my mind, at least at the time, one of the reasons that it was exciting, to be able to think that you could understand something that was beneath and underpinning so many other things.
Did you read much sort of popular science when you were younger? Did that have
So
an
I did.
impact at all?
I did. I was certainly reading, bits of Scientific American and the Martin Gardner,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
articles, and occasionally, some of the popular science writers, although they weren't
Mm,
as prevalent and visible then
mm,
as they are now. Um,
yeah.
but so I think that was a little bit in the mix. I had an excellent physics teacher, but I think that was and which was fun. But that was just one year out of many
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the
You
in
probably
school.
already had the bug by then. You probably helped him more than he helped you, perhaps. But by having a good student who's interested often helps. What about general reading? Did you read while was reading a big part? Did you read,
Yeah, I
fiction,
was
comic books,
absolutely. I was a big reader. I think also there was a period when we were growing up where, in some sense, science and engineering was a little bit more of a bit more of the backwater culturally.
Mhm.
Right, that the dominant thread of being an intellectually interested person was not in the science side of the world.
Absolutely.
It was the humanities and a little bit the social sciences. And so I thought that I was somebody who I wanted to be part of the whole conversation.
Yeah.
So I was, reading all sorts of things, growing up, and I felt like it was very important to learn how to write and to think about fiction, and that fiction and learning how to understand one's, emotions, that those were part of it, even though I was a bit more of a rationalist myself, and that it was important to learn not just to be a rationalist, because that was not where the cultural center was.
Yeah, sure, certainly, and in some sense, I used to bemoan that too. That somehow being an intellectual, having taught at Yale for almost a decade, I could just see it where they didn't have to really take any science, but the idea was that to be an intellectual, and we generally feel you have to be literate at some level in history and English. What's disappointing is somehow people think you can be literate and not have any scientific sense at all, and that's what books like this and other books are meant to counteract. Is that to be a literate person without scientific literacy is you can't, and I think that's really something that we need to point out. It's not something just from column B. It's an important part of our culture, an important part of the solutions that are going to keep us going in one way or another in the 21st century.
I think
Okay, well, what about
one of the odd things about that, that there's been a cultural shift, I'd say, at in the academic world, where the intellectual center has started moving much more towards the sciences in many universities. But what's unfortunate is that that didn't achieve what you're describing, which was to make everybody feel like you need this full
Yeah.
picture of the world in order to be an educated, thoughtful person. Instead, it's just moved from being single-minded here to being single-minded there, and I think and so now we've lost what you can learn from the humanities and social sciences in an integrated sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot. My own feeling, having written about this lately and been influenced, part of that is due to, unfortunately, the stifling of asking questions. The kind of questions in science you can ask questions, and they're not politically charged often, depending on what science you do. Certainly in our field, although even in our field, some people would argue. But in other areas, when you ask a question, it can create a lot of pushback. And I think,
Yes.
unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why people are less willing to have that kind of open-ended experience, partly for self-preservation. But
No, I
anyway,
think that's
that's a different discussion. I bet you've probably seen it in Berkeley, and I'm sure you've seen it in Berkeley because I know what's happening there as well as everywhere else. So
and in
you,
some sense, we're hoping that a bit of the approaches of the book that we'll get to,
mhm,
we're hoping that are a way of perhaps undercutting that and getting back to ability to think together.
be great. It'd be great. That's an optimistic hope, and we'll see. But yeah, I'm skeptical of everything, and we'll get to skepticism. So that's important.
Good.
Um, The last thing before I want to get up to the beginning of your training, really, and to the issues of, and we're not going to spend as much time here talking about your work as we might otherwise, although it'll come in the context of through examples in the context of the book. Um, one other question I'm interested about your background. You went to public school first and then a private school, right? And
Yes.
I'm wondering whether you could contrast that, whether one or the other had a bigger impact on you.
Well, to be fair, my public school experience ended up being only 1/3 of first grade.
Oh,
Um,
oh,
and
okay. I didn't realize that. Okay, so it was limited.
No,
You
exactly.
went
I mean, my parents chose to move to a neighborhood that had a strong public school that that they believed in public education. But at the end of the third or first grade, they realized I was bored, and so they ended up moving me back to another very strong school system, which is the Quaker school system in
Yeah, the
Philadelphia.
Friends system. A lot of people I know, Quaker Friends. I know people in the area who, yeah, in fact, um, Joe, what's his name? He won the Nobel Prize for gravitation with an old
Taylor,
friend of mine. What?
Taylor,
What?
Joe
Yeah, Joe
Taylor.
Taylor, who I've known for a long time. He had a big background in the Quaker schools and
I
probably
did. I
more.
didn't realize he was too. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, he definitely did, and I think continued to be involved with them. But anyway, um, okay, and so that experience, was obviously useful. A school where it was open for you and encouraged you to reach out beyond where you might otherwise, which then gave you the kind of, not only just the kind of training, but I suppose the kind of imprimatur, for better or worse, to get into Harvard. And then at Harvard you immediately decided to do physics. It wasn't a choice. Um, uh,
Well, no, actually, for me, I was torn between the two very fundamental things I could think of at the time, which were physics and philosophy.
yeah.
And and I looked into the possibility of doing a double major of physics and philosophy, but it turned out that at that time, if you did that, that would take up all your courses. And I also want to take literature and economics and
Mm,
history and and
yeah.
whatever else. And
You
so,
dodged a good bullet. I think in the end, I mean, I was same. I was fascinated by philosophy, and in fact, as a high school student, read J- James Jean's book Physics and Philosophy. It's one of the things that got me interested
ah,
more in physics.
yes.
And later on, I was going to go to Oxford with a Rhodes Scholarship to do physics and philosophy. I'm just glad I dodged that bullet and decided to go to the U.S. and do physics instead. But anyway, but uh, yeah, you were an undergraduate when I was at the same time when I was a graduate student in the region, and then I moved to Harvard. I think after you left to go to Berkeley, um, uh, and I'm sure a bunch of my friends and colleagues taught you, and it had a good program. Howard George, I was really interested in teaching. I don't know if he taught you at all, and
Yeah, yeah. No, I actually took a really interesting um, small, like 5-person seminar from him because it was the off year when he was not teaching group theory, and so 5 of us asked him, could he just teach us it as an independent, study? And so we had well, it was actually very interesting because he is such a character as a strong. Uh, how to describe it? He's so warm and friendly, and when you're in a small room with him with a bunch of people, he's constantly smiling and nodding, and
Yeah, he's always smiling.
you can't help but smile and nod too. And so it meant that it was often very hard to break it to him as best we could that we weren't understanding something, because he would be explaining things to us, and we'd be smiling and nodding, and then somehow at the end we all leave the class and say, we have to go back and say to him, we just didn't get it. And
You might this maybe give you some consolation having been a colleague. You might imagine that perhaps it was going the other way as well. Sometimes, he may have been smiling and nodding sometimes and not understanding what you were saying. So, but anyway, yeah, he taught a course in physics for hot shops. When I was there at the Society Fellows, I got to teach a week of it when he went away, and it was kind of
oh,
a neat,
that's
fun
good.
thing.
Yeah.
And anyway, it was really useful. But then what made you choose Berkeley after you to get your PhD?
So for me, it ended up being a pretty clear choice because I knew I wanted to do experimental physics, not theoretical physics, um,
Hmm.
but I didn't know which area of experimental physics. So I wanted there to be a place that was very strong in a broad range of
Yes.
areas, and Berkeley at the time, probably Berkeley and MIT were the
Yeah.
two that had the broadest range of experimental physics programs that were strong. And MIT to me still came across as too much of a science nerd
Yeah.
world, and
Yeah.
I wanted to meet people in all fields. And so I think that was probably the final thing. I do remember though taking Princeton very seriously. I mean, among others,
Yeah.
but because they had this very strong tradition in
Yeah.
experimental physics, smaller, more boutique in that
Mm.
sense. Um, but I do remember at the time talking to current grad students at that time, and they all said, the great thing about this program is that it only takes 4 years. They guarantee 4 years, and you're out. And it's isolated. We're a little lonely. It's we're a little bit miserable, but it's only 4 years. It's great. I went to visit Berkeley, and for me, it was off the ends of the earth because it was California.
Yeah.
I'd never been outside the East Coast, for in the United States before, and although I'd been in Europe, and
Yeah.
and so I asked the grad students here. I wasn't seriously considering it because it was so far away, and they said, "Oh, actually, they don't know how long it takes. They haven't actually even looked. They're having a great time, and they don't even care." And at that point, I thought, well, grad school is part of your life. You might as well, feel like you're going to enjoy it.
Absolutely. I often say that, yeah, when students ask me, you can get a good education in a lot of places, but go to a place you want to be. And I was thinking that for a nice young boy who'd been on the East Coast the whole time, going to Berkeley, not just in terms of other disciplines, you're right. MIT is more focused. I did my PhD at MIT. It's more focused. Berkeley is obviously much better, but sociologically, um, the Berkeley environment would have opened you to vastly different experiences than if you'd stayed on the East Coast. Absolutely.
No, I think that's right. That's right. And of course, you don't know what the cultural differences are until you've lived in
So
these
you,
places. But it was very interesting to spend time then to have ways in which I felt like I missed the East Coast. And then you go to the East Coast and you realize, actually now I miss the West Coast too. That there are things that you actually start recognizing in yourself both places.
But you also mentioned something else, which is good as advice for students. And again, I've always tried to do it, which is if you don't know exactly what you want to do, go to a place where there are a lot of options, because you might find, and even if you do know exactly what you want to do, you might find that what you wanted to do was not what you want to do, and if there's no other option, you're in a bad
Yeah.
situation. So try, if you can, to go to a place where you can get exposure to a variety of different, in physics, say, experiment a lot of different areas, and you might be surprised. And so it's nice to go to a place, big place. And I went to a place where I was the only student to graduate. I did a degree in physics and math, and then I went to MIT where there are like 300 students in physics. It was a big difference, but it's nice to have that experience of seeing all the different things. But you say you wanted to go into experiment. I meant to ask you another question, which I will answer now. I'm always interested in experimentalists, asking them this as a theorist. So why did you want to be an experimentalist? As a kid, did you tinker? A lot of the experimentalists I know had ham radios or other things. Did you tinker, or is it what made you want to be an experimentalist?
It's a good question because I'm trying to remember now, thinking back. I was a very minor tinkerer, so I would. I think one of my pleasures was with some friends. We would make little Rube Goldberg machines where
Yeah.
this thing would trigger that thing, and I was always enjoying looking up and learning about new little mechanisms that you could try. But I also really enjoyed learning about computer programming, and I think because that was becoming available to us
Sure,
during
it's a
that
huge
period.
thing for
And
nerds.
every time I learned about a new algorithm out there in the world, I would try to think, oh, is there a fun activity, a fun game I could make, using that algorithm in a computer? So I was a bit of a computer tinkerer as well at that time. So, and I don't know whether those things were what led me. It may have been that I was perhaps I remember one of the things that was most striking to me as a Scientific American reader was when I first read the articles about the aspect experiments
Yeah.
and the and I remember the for me one of these
For listeners, that those are experiments testing sort of quantum mechanics directly in the lab. Sorry, go on.
no exactly and they were showing things that the world worked in ways that shouldn't be allowed to work in, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think I realized that for me, one of the real excitements and pleasures of being a physicist is catching the world in the act of doing something that it shouldn't be allowed to do. That but based on how our brains work, we don't think it should. We don't think that should be a possibility, and yet we find out that the world does that. And I think being close up to that sort of thing, being able to see it directly as an experimentalist, was something that I was attracted to.
Okay, well that's great. But did any of the labs as an undergraduate? For me, the labs as an undergraduate turned me off. That's one of the reasons I did a math degree was to do fewer labs. Um, but uh, did they turn you on as an undergrad?
In general, there was this problem that class labs
Mhm.
were so canned, right?
Yeah,
That you knew what you were supposed to see and you knew what you're supposed to do, and so it was rare that one would really excite you. I'd say the closest was I remember doing a lab with superfluid with helium,
mhm.
and seeing it do some of its surprising behaviors,
Yeah,
and so that but other than that, I mean, I'd say that you're right that I was still waiting to become a physicist. I mean, I
yeah.
remember I considered, for example, taking a year off and doing a traveling fellowship or something
Mm,
like that, and I did not get the traveling fellowship I was applying for,
mhm.
and I was thinking, well, should I do something else? And I thought, actually, the problem is I've not really dived into physics. I've taken my courses every year, every semester.
Mhm.
Um, there's one physics course or two, and a math course, and then I would
Mm,
take my English and my
mm.
whatever
Yeah.
else philosophy and
Mm.
courses. But I didn't really feel like I had dived into physics yet. And also during that period, it was harder to do something substantial as a undergraduate in a research lab. I think over the years, all the universities have gotten much better at bringing the undergraduates
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
to it. But I worked a little bit in one or two labs, like in the summer, and I
Yeah.
never felt I really got to do much. So I was at that point feeling like, well, why don't I go to grad school just so I can find out, do I really like this physics stuff? I was
Oh,
almost, I wanted to give it a try.
oh, well, that's good. It was an experiment, as an experiment about
Yeah,
becoming an
yeah,
experimentalist.
I think that's
No,
right.
no, I think that's great. I agree. I went to graduate school not expecting a lab, but I thought, what the heck? But and I think it's really important again to give advice to students. Too many people think about jobs. You don't know what the job market is going to be like. And as you said, you really want to, if you're going to spend your life with something, it should be something you enjoy. But also, you don't know, so try it
Yep.
and and see if it works, and be governed by that more than the likelihood that it will lead you some specific place that it probably won't lead you anyway. Um, but okay, you knew you wanted to be experimentalist, but you didn't know what area. I mean, it wasn't as if astrophysics was something that had been a central preoccupation like some people. Um,
No, in fact, I had almost no astronomy background. I mean, unlike many of my colleagues who had backyard telescopes,
yeah,
etc., I had almost zero contact with astronomy, and I was assuming that I was going to. I knew I wanted something that was getting at these fundamental questions
yeah,
that were surprising things about how the
yeah,
fundamentals work,
yeah. Of
in the world. And so the most obvious thing at that time was that a huge amount was happening in particle physics. The
course.
big accelerator projects. And so I was assuming I probably would do a particle physics project. And I looked at some of the groups, but there was a bit of a tension going the other direction, which was that you tended to be in a huge well, at
Yeah.
that time they were big, but they've become even bigger.
Even bigger. Yeah.
These collaborations, and I think I wasn't quite ready to sort of join into a being part of a huge culture. I wanted something where I had a little bit more chance to be a bigger
Sure.
part of the project myself. And so there were a few of the faculty who were doing what were particle physics like projects, but they were with very small groups. And so one was Professor Buford Price
Yeah.
at Berkeley, where they were doing experiments, where they were looking at tracks of particles and plastics, and there was uh, only a half dozen people, maybe even two or three on a given project, and so you could feel like you were doing something substantial. I probably would have stayed in that group, except for the fact that the timing of when the next big project was about to happen would have meant that I would have worked up to the point of maybe taking it out to the field, but never had enough time to collect the data and analyze it. So I started looking around for another group, and I found this rather surprising group that Professor Richard Muller was running at the time, where it was surprising in the sense that he was fearless about taking on any technique, any scientific
Hmm.
topic that was of interest, where he thought he had an angle that would get at something interesting. And so that meant that, at the time I joined that particular group, there was they were doing one project that was a um, a tabletop cyclotron that could be used for mass spectrometry. There was another project that was doing Raman scattering to study carbon in the atmosphere. That you picked up these samples by flying high flying airplanes over the ocean, and so it was looking at the carbon cycle. There was another project they just finished, which was the first adaptive optics project, where they made a adaptive mirror that would take out the twinkling of the sky of the stars.
Hmm.
Um, there was still we were still associated with a group that had done CMB measurements, because that was one of his first projects, was measuring the CMB dipole. And so all these things were going on, including some astrophysics projects. And that one of them was a robotic supernova search project, which could use my computer interests. And and it was getting at something that I thought could be kind of deep. It was getting at the age of the universe, which of course was one of your topics, and trying to measure the Hubble constant with nearby supernova was the idea at the time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Sure.
and so that was going on, and I remember thinking, astrophysics could be a way into all this stuff, because it does have high energy events happening.
Yeah.
Maybe you could get at some of the things you get at with these particle accelerator experiments using astrophysics. And so I started getting interested in, can I learn enough astrophysics to make that a alternative tool for this? And so that was sort of the starting point.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I've often thought about that, and I was thinking about that when reading your book. That it was a very fortunate experience for you, particularly, I think, to be in Rich Muller's group, who had that all over the place attitude, and you're able to find the right thing. As you say, a lot of students get turned off from particle physics if you're an experimentalist, because it's a very large group. As a theorist, I mean, that's why I got into particle physics, because it was the fundamental stuff, and I didn't need.
Yeah,
And as a theorist, it didn't need to be in a big group. But
that's right.
interestingly, it also shows you never know where you're going to go either. I mean, you and I share that. Unlike a lot of people who do astrophysics, I think I was a professor of astronomy as well as physics for almost 40 years, but I never took a single course in astronomy or astrophysics, even up to and including my PhD. So you never know what's going to go.
That's
But
right.
I
I
think it's
remember.
also so. Go on.
I remember there was a point where three of us, grad students in physics, realized that all of us were using astrophysics as our tool, and none of us had taken a course. And so we sat down together every week. We meet and we take turns teaching each other, going through all the different textbooks that we could find,
Oh,
just to see whether we could like catch up, on some of this stuff. So basically, almost all of my astrophysics, was taught from these two other grad students.
students. Well, that's a good way to learn. I mean, most of what and lifelong learning. Most of what I don't know if it's the same for you, but I always tell people I've learned a lot more physics after my PhD than before, and I think it's true, and it's part of lifelong learning. The process of lifelong learning, in some sense, is what the books about as well. I think it's also, I think, poetic that Rich Muller was not only your mentor in that way, but if you think about this book, I mean, he started writing books like Thinking and teaching a course about physics for future presidents, which is again a very similarly motivated idea, which is to use the techniques of science not just to become scientifically literate, but to think like a scientist and use that in the public arena, which is really what this is all about.
No, absolutely, and I mentioned a couple points in the book, but I do feel like so much of the of that style of thinking that I was interested in when it came to developing the course and then this book comes very clearly from what I learned from him and from his relationship with his mentor Louis Alvarez,
Louis
and
Alvarez,
yeah, and so there was
great
a very
scholar.
interesting, certainly a thread of, and of course, when you talk to other physicists, they all feel like that's their culture too. That this is something that I think was the implicit background of so much of how the physicists thought about the world that just wasn't usually articulated.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's nice. You're right. Alvarez, of course, influenced you as well as Muller. He had that style as well, and and yeah, and you. So it's nice to see everyone following in their mentors' footprints in one way or another. But let's get to the book. So it is written with two collaborators from who are both of them at Berkeley. Is that right?
At the time when we started the course, they were both at
So it's
Berkeley.
based on a course that you decided. I wanted to ask what caused you to start the course, and how did the three of you come together? Doesn't have to be a long story, but I'm interested. It's not, as far as I can see. I didn't get that out of the book, and I'm just wondering how you found
Yeah,
these
no,
kindred
no.
spirits.
I mean, what really happened was I remember. Oh, I've been long thinking that'd be fun to try to teach some of this material that I had been learning as a grad student and postdoc over the years, et cetera. But I remember there's one point where I was watching our society try to make just simple practical decisions like, should we raise the debt ceiling? Surprisingly, that was a question back,
Mm,
10,
yeah,
15 years ago too. And I was thinking that it was a little weird to see that the discussions about it they almost seemed like religious discussions where they had nothing to
certainly
do
do.
with the
Still do.
content of why would you raise the debt ceiling? What does it matter? Et cetera. And when you heard scientists at the lunch table talking about topics like this, they were using all sorts of different vocabulary and different of ideas of how you think about a problem that you just weren't hearing out in the world. And I found myself thinking, where do we learn all this stuff? Since it's not taught in any physics course or biology course or chemistry course that I know of. And I realized it was all taught by apprenticeship,
Yeah.
essentially. And so that was a starting point. I thought, well, could I try to articulate these and start to teach it? And so at the time, I was developing a course in physics and music. And so I started saying, could we do a course where we have, let's say, we'll teach 3 ideas from physics and music and 3 ideas from how scientific thinking works in every class.
Mm.
And so we started building around that concept. And then I started thinking, this stuff really should be taught by itself even. And it should be a course on this. And it's not good enough just coming as a physicist to it because, you go to a faculty meeting of physicists and they don't necessarily act any more rationally than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I thought, we needed some other parts of the story. And I want to find a social psychologist. I want to find a philosopher. And so I went out and brought in and found these two other faculty members, one of whom was a social psychologist who was working in the public policy school, which is even better
Hmm.
because he had this other, legal
Yeah.
and public policy connection. And then the philosopher was somebody who'd done, philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. And I realized that those were really important ingredients in the story. And so that's where we started. And then I
But
and
how
then
did
I
you find them? What did you do? Did you put out a notice, or you just went to the school, or you had asked people who you might talk to? It's always interesting to me.
So
Sorry,
the
go on.
philosopher I'd found in a group that was already meeting, that was and still meets sometimes, of a bunch of scientists and artists and theater people who meet regularly and give little presentations to each other what they're working on. And
Okay.
so he happened to come into that group, and so I started meeting with him and discussing different ideas, and this was one of them. The social psychologist, Rob McCoon, and the philosopher was John Campbell. The philosopher,
Hmm.
Rob McCoon, was I asked around from because I was interested. There was a new course concept that Berkeley was developing called Big Idea courses, where you were supposed to bring together faculty from different fields. Like, you could have a musician, a historian, and a physicist talking about time, the concept of time, or
Hmm.
something like that in a course. And so
Yeah.
I thought this would be a good one for that. And I found that the person who was organizing it actually knew faculty from all across campus. And she said, you should go talk to the dean of the public policy school, because he really is pretty sharp about these kinds of things. And he said to me, "Oh, this guy would be great for this." And so that's how it started. And I just made a cold call appointment, sat down in his office, described the course, and he got all excited. It was something that he really cared about, and so the whole thing just fell together nicely. We also ended up feeling like to develop a course like this, you needed to really think through what is it you want to teach, because
Of
it wasn't
course.
obvious. So we put a sign up saying, "Are you embarrassed watching our society make decisions? Come help invent a course. Come help save the world." And about 30 people, graduate students, postdoc students, started showing up every week. At the end of the week on Fridays, we would meet around 4 o'clock, and we go on, past dinner, just trying to think through what would make a good vocabulary of ideas that would help people
Oh.
think through problems. And went over about 9 months, and we in the end developed, I think, like 23 concepts. And then we started asking, how would you teach them in a way that felt experiential, where people would actually remember them afterwards and see it in the world when it came up. And that led to us teaching the course with many of these people. Then got involved as the teaching staff.
Oh, well, that's impressive, Saul. I figured it, like many things, just came together and tried it out, and see what worked and see what didn't, and spend a week preparing the class. But it's nice to see that there was actually more thought that went into it, and the thought clearly comes out in the book. What I'd like to do, really, the purpose of the book is, as far as I can see, and tell me if I'm paraphrasing it incorrectly, is to how to use scientific ideas to help deal with the 21st century and beyond, really. And is that
Yes,
a
I
reasonable?
think, I think that's right. And the only thing that maybe I would add would be both personally as individuals, but also as groups in that we're in, and as societies that we're in.
Absolutely, and we'll get to that. The need to deal with groups well. I thought there was something interesting and overlapped well, actually, with a podcast I did with someone else that we'll talk to. But I'd like to work through it, in if you don't mind, and in some detail, I hope, and because the ideas are interesting, and so they'll be familiar to some of our listeners in certain ways. But one of the first things that you talk about, which I think is important, people say, why do you want to teach people how to think like a scientist? What does it matter? Why do you want to teach them to think like a musician or a? And the point is, it's not the sense that science is more valuable than music or art or literature, but the fact is science works, and it works in a specific way. And then one of the first chapters you have is about how science works, and and it applies to the real world. So since you begin the book with that, I thought I'd ask you about that issue.
I mean, there's an interesting period in the academic world where people were so enamored with discovering how all of our perspectives, come from different historical contexts,
Yeah.
etc., that I think that they were losing touch of the fact that there were also commonalities. Um, and one of the most important commonalities is the interest in understanding that world out there that's going to go on doing its thing, no matter whether we're good or bad at getting it, or whether or not our particular cultural framing is helping us or hurting us. And that feels like it's such an important starting point, that people feel like they actually share a common world out there, and that we don't necessarily have good access to it. We don't necessarily understand it, what's going on every time. But if our collective jobs are partly to be effective in it, we want collectively to understand what's there, in the same way that you want to know. Sometimes I say to people, it's to some extent, you want to think of this a little bit like, to what extent is there a table in the room, that you're in the middle of the room, the dining room table, let's say, that that there are ways in which tables are collections of mostly empty space and with some atoms, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, you can't walk across the room through the table. You want to know there's a table there enough so you won't try to walk through it. And that sense of there being a reality out there that's going to do its thing no matter what we would like it to do, is, I think, a really good starting place. And that you want people to feel like they want together to understand enough of that reality so they don't just make stupid mistakes or miss opportunities that we can do things in the world.
Yeah, it's a good point. You don't say it in the book, I think, but and that's why, people often say young children are scientists. And of course, that's the whole point. You're learning that. You're learning not to touch a hot stove. The very early stages of your existence are learning that there is a real world out there, and objects are sharp or hot or cold, and the cliffs and other things. And we learn that effectively. The good news is that those people who don't learn it effectively, I don't know, it's not good news. But I mean, the people who don't learn it effectively probably don't live long enough to reproduce, as Charles Darwin would say. And so effectively, evolutionists and evolutionary psychology has taught us, and every individual in the process of their growing up, at least in the early stages, is a scientist. Unfortunately, we beat it out of a lot of people in the interim. But and I think the point, which even more strongly, and I think you say it, but it is that we want to learn how the universe works, but we've learned, but through a long history, certainly the last 500 years, but even longer in certain ways, we've learned a set of tools that allow us to do that. It's not just that we want to do that. For better or worse, science is, and it's unambiguous, it's not some value judgment. Science is the effective way to learn how the universe works and how not to make mistakes in general when it comes to the physical reality.
And to say it even more strongly, if we learn that there is some other better way to do it than we're currently doing it, we would happily switch, right?
That's the point. We'd happily throw out like yesterday's newspaper. We'll
Right,
talk
and
about that too. I
that
mean,
science, right, and science in some sense is it's the hunt for ways to learn about the world effectively and not to fool ourselves, right? And that's and it will go along with any way that does that, you know.
exactly, and we'll change what we're doing if it doesn't work. That I mean the process of science is to find out what works and what doesn't, and keep using the things that work and throw out the things that don't. It's not some ideology. It's not we have some secret handshakes, and in particular, and you say this later in the book, but it is a set of tools that's almost designed to overcome the natural tendencies of individual scientists and individual peoples to fool ourselves.
Yes,
We all come equipped with a whole bunch of things to fool ourselves. That includes scientists. And again, as you point out in faculty meetings, you see that rampantly. You see it everywhere. If you can use the tools of science, it can help filter out and avoid some of the red herrings that otherwise would be there.
exactly. And I also, would like to emphasize that it's aspirational, right? It's the scientists want to do this. It's not that they're always doing it, and they often are making mistakes of
Oh,
exactly the kinds
absolutely.
that we're describing in the book. And I do it myself, and the people who are teaching it do it all the time, just because we're human. That's and we're bound to do these things. What we try is to build a culture of people who at least understand these kinds of mistakes, so that when you make one of these mistakes, somebody will call you on it, and or they'll help you and say, wait, what? Don't fall into that trap. You're about to step over there. And that's what you really want. You want a group of people who help each other make the mistakes less. Not that we will ever be perfect at it, but we'll do it a little less, and that's allowed us to learn things about the world that otherwise we never would have.
A good point, and implicit in that, and you made the point, and people don't realize that science is a social activity because it was always the case that individual scientists get led astray, and that's okay. And you talk about how it's possible, and we'll get to there, how it's possible to get led astray if you're a scientist. But the great thing about science is it isn't done in an isolated way. It requires a community. It requires a community of people who are willing to openly challenge you,
Yes,
and we don't view that as a threat or something that shouldn't be allowed, or that you're being hostile or offensive or somehow oppressive, that you expect to be challenged. And it's a shame, if we get an environment where people are afraid to challenge, because it's really important. That challenge means that when you're doing something, fooling yourself, someone else will help you. It's not to attack you; it's to get to the truth. And
absolutely,
that
absolutely.
community is really important.
No, absolutely, and I think this other element of the fact that you need people who will be motivated to disagree with you. In fact, you need people who are, in some sense, on the other side of some team gaming.
Yeah.
It's because otherwise, it's just too easy for people to not catch things where they're falling into some mental trap together. And so somebody has got to be giving you a hard time, and you actually want those people who are annoying to you in some ways, because otherwise, there's no way to get that rigorous a analysis of where you could have gone wrong.
Exactly. You said it well. You really need the annoying people, and again, that's what worries me about our society right now, and academic society in particular.
No, no,
But
and I think the public, I mean, this current style of saying I don't want to hear anybody who is I think is wrong, is giving it's disarming yourself, right? It's giving up one of your best tools that you want those people because they'll help you. They won't be necessarily right about everything they're saying, but they will be really good at finding the places that you're wrong,
yeah,
and you don't want to be wrong. You want to actually work well in the world with with some understanding of it.
yeah, and I again we said this before, but I think it's you can't emphasize too much that this notion of I think from David Hume originally, and I learned it from Chris Hitchens, but that freedom of speech isn't the freedom. The important part of freedom of speech is not the freedom to say something, but if you give it up, you've lost the freedom to learn that you're wrong,
Yeah,
and that's really what's important. And Jonathan Rauch, who's done who's on, we did a podcast with a wonderful um, writer and journalist, and in his own right philosopher, pointed I think really made that clearest to me first that science requires a dialectic. Science as an activity cannot progress without a dialectic, without that constant give and take, with the constant battering of every idea, because only by battering ideas will the good ones survive. Anyway, well, okay, I think we've gone enough. Let's talk about some of the good ideas and some of the bad ones. The next thing you go into, which is a really important understanding, but also a really important red herring, has to do with correlation versus causation, and you have a chapter about that, and that's probably one of the biggest mistakes many of us make. You do something, and you think it's easy, especially when you want there to be a cause.
yeah.
But it's easy to notice that something happens when something else happens, and to ascribe causation. And one of the biggest challenge, one of the biggest red herrings, one of the biggest mistakes one can make is to assume a cause that isn't there, and also to learn how to tell the difference between correlation causation. So I turn it over to you to
No,
expand on that.
no, exactly, and I think that probably maybe the classic example that really brings us home is that if somebody comes to you and says they can cure your disease, and if you're not well, you're highly motivated to want to believe that what they're offering you it will cure the disease, and they often are highly motivated because they happen to have taken whatever this thing was or they did whatever it was and they got better and they're really excited that they have the possibility of helping you in that way. So it's the perfect meeting of two people who both want to believe that this thing is going to work, and throw into that the fact that sometimes placebo effect even means that if you believe it, it'll help. So all these are it's like the perfect storm for places where you will assume that the causal connection is established just because somebody took this thing and they got better. You should take it. You will get better. And so that's one of these places where I think little by little, people eventually realize that they have to start using other ways to tell which drugs are actually helpful and which ones are, what snake oil salesmen or even well-meaning people who just have the wrong understanding of what was causing what. This led to the current practice of using randomized controlled trials, and so we begin there as describing it as becoming like a paradigm of if you can, that would be the thing you always would love to do. You'd love to be able to say, we'll take just this one variable and we'll change this one, and we'll just see whether that one variable, when we change it, leaving everything else constant, does it change the outcome? But of course, we then go on to point out that you can't really do randomized control trials for many things. It turns out you can do it for drugs, but it's a very slow process. And so it's not always the easiest way to get an answer if you're in a hurry, like if somebody's going to die. But for many things like our field, cosmology, we have very few chances to do randomized controlled trials with galaxies and the universe.
With the universe, yeah, we don't have the ability to try things with different universes to see what works and what doesn't.
So we've had to just invent other ways to capture some of that same ability to recognize what things are causal and what things are just happen to correlate with each other.
And there are a lot of strange correlations. I'll tell you about one which relates to actually an important physics thing. But you hit on something that resonated with me too. That one of my favorite books of Carl Sagan was a Demon Haunted World, which is science as a brief candle in the dark.
Yeah.
And speaking of the wanting to cure you, he did point out about, I mean, an organized version of this, which is the Catholic Church and the miracle at Lourdes, where
Ah,
it's a remarkable example. People go to Lourdes to be cured, and 130 million pilgrims have gone to Lourdes, and the Catholic Church keeps careful notes, and there was something like 27, you know, cures that they could not explain otherwise. And of course, as he points out, no one regenerated an arm, but there were cures from cancer and other things. And then you look at the background data and you find out that, sure, cancers often go into spontaneous remission. And in fact, in the background population, the rate of spontaneous remission was greater than that of people who went to Lourdes. But if you went to Lourdes and you were cured of cancer, there's no way I could ever convince you that it wasn't that miracle.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a wonderful example of our wanting of what Fox Mulder said in the X-Files. We want to believe, and we have to realize this is one of those human traits that you talk about in the book too. But we have to realize we all want to believe, and it comes up again and again in the book. And so, what science teaches us to say, okay, let's recognize we want to believe, and let's find some external tools that can convince ourselves that maybe we're wrong, which is the hardest thing to do. But the correlation that, I remember when I worked on solar neutrinos for a long time, because it was a big mystery. And Ray Davis, who was a wonderful experimentalist, an old friend, and who won the Nobel Prize for discovering an amazing experiment that first detected neutrinos from the sun, which are the result of the processes inside the sun that power the sun. But he found lots of interesting correlations between that neutrino signal and other things. And I remember spending a fair amount of time looking at those statistics. And the question, with something is correlated to something else, you have to ask yourself, is there a physical mechanism that might suggest that correlation is reasonable? One of the most amusing correlations that you could find, and he didn't ascribe any significance to it, but it turns out that for many years, the number of neutrinos in that experiment was correlated to the stock market. And there's an example where it's clearly you can't see a physical correlation, but sometimes it's not so obvious. So one of the ways out of that trap is to say, if there's a correlation, can I think of a plausible physical mechanism that could provide that correlation? If there isn't, it's probably spurious.
That's right. And I think that one of the things that we also discuss in the book elsewhere, probably, that as scientists, you often start to learn is how often you see things that are just random that look to us as if they're significant. And that, I don't think most of us have at all a sense for, you flipped a coin, how often would you see long runs of heads or tails? It's just not something that our brains are well calibrated at. And so we're constantly seeing things that we think, "Whoa, that looks interesting." And it turns out that, lots of it is just random. If you flipped a coin, that's what you would see. And that is probably one of the biggest takeaways for, young scientists, is little by little learning that you always have to compare anything you get excited by to what you would have seen if you just did a random version of it.
Yeah, in fact, it's one of your chapters. We're going to get there. And there's some examples I really like, and one I want to question you about from your own experience. Not the one you think I'm going to actually, perhaps, maybe anyway. You mentioned one regarding pulsars, and we'll talk about that, but also other things. But the next chapter is deals with, I think, one of the most important unsung values of science, and it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like a constraint or a failing of science, and that has to do with uncertainty. I think I want to read. A paragraph, if you don't mind, from your book. Science offers us a radically different way to think about our connections to reality. This reality that we know something, but not everything about. It allows us to shift from a stance that says we can only work with things that we're absolutely certain of, to a stance that says we're actually more successful if we can work with things that we have a varying degrees of confidence in. Furthermore, just understanding the concept that confidence comes in degrees can be much more powerful than holding out for definitive answers in a world where available evidence usually fails to give us an absolute certainty we'd like. And I think that's the point, that the recognizing that everything is uncertain, even in science, every single measure you make is uncertain, is not a failing. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the world. And it also, as you point out, involves another key aspect that Richard Feynman, I'll quote him a number of times in our discussion, talked about, which is scientific honesty. The willingness to say, I don't know for sure. An honesty that you wish politicians would have, and sometimes parents and sometimes teachers, So anyway, uncertainty. Your turn.
Yeah, no, I think you've captured the starting point really well, and I think that in some sense we disarm ourselves if and we're just working with if you just worked with black and white and that was all you had available to you, the world would just be a lot less interesting place, and you would know a lot less about the world because not everything is black or white, and in fact, almost everything is not. And so you really want to be able to work with the full palette of what the experience of the world is like, where some things very strongly and other things rather weakly, and that is real information that's actually allowing you to do things in the world, and otherwise you're just bumbling along, only seeing things when they happen to be those two colors.
Absolutely. I think it's the realization of the real world. It's not just science. I mean, we all realize the real world is uncertain, but I don't think many people realize that scientists realize that everything they're doing is uncertain. And to be able to say, um, uh, to be able to say, not only I don't know, but I'm not certain, is essential. And one of the things that science does that maybe the rest of society doesn't, um, is that is that being able to say how confident you are quantitatively
Yeah.
is incredibly important. And so we don't do that. But one of the things science does is let's quantify our uncertainty to say, okay, I'm 90% certain, and that really means something. That's just not something I invent. Oh, I'm 90% certain that you're, mean, or something. But we actually work hard to find a way so we know if we did this experiment 100 times, I expect that 90% of the time it would come up with what I'm thinking. And sometimes we're wrong, of course, but quantifying uncertainty, not just recognizing that it exists, is incredibly important.
No, and it also allows for a few different things. For example, you can now be a very rigorous and proud person about your ability to recognize roughly what the certainty is, not about being right or wrong. And you don't want to be married to being right or wrong, because then you don't have the opportunity to change, to be open to learning new things.
To be
You want to be married to having a pretty healthy guess as to where your confidence is, and so that you will be proud when you discover that 1 out of 10 of your papers where you said you're 90% sure about something, that those 1 out of 10 better be wrong, or you're not doing your job well. And
Yeah.
that's good. I mean, to be able to be proud that some fraction of what you did was wrong is actually allows you a whole different kind of freedom, and ego investment in a much better place than being right.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point, and actually it'll lead to where we're going to go next in a sense. But um, having that confidence, also one of the words, I don't know how you feel about this, but people always say, do you believe this or do you believe that? And I say in science, I don't think, and I actually don't think anywhere should we use the word believe.
Yeah.
The way science works is you say this is likely or unlikely,
Yeah.
and this is very likely or very unlikely, but believing is irrelevant. What
Yes.
matters is it likely to be true or is it unlikely to be true? And if it's so likely to be true, we might use the word believe, and you and I probably use it, even though I try not to. But that's the key point. It's likely or unlikely. And that's all science can ever really say. It can never say it's impossible in a well. Maybe that's too deep a philosophical question to go into here. But in general, it's something is either very very, and like the sun is going to rise tomorrow is very very likely. I mean, it's possible that it might not, but it's so likely that we say I believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow. So that level.
Right, and I say to people that that just because you're using probabilistic language doesn't mean that you can't be pretty sure about some things. I mean, the some things you give it 99.99999%, and you will bet your life on them, right? Which is an unusual. It's literally true, right? We will get on an airplane and we bet our life on the idea that these many tons of metal are going to fly. That isn't a obvious thing that you should be able to do, and yet we will cheerfully do it almost every day, but that's very different than saying that it is guaranteed, that this is absolutely true.
And the next chapter you talk about is when scientists do get because they're human. One of the secrets that scientists are human. One of the hidden secrets about science is that is overconfidence. And we all tend to be overconfident in the things we believe in, and scientists can be too. And you often see that. And so when scientists are wrong, they're not penalized so much if they're wrong and they say they weren't certain. When they're penalized, they just say we know this happens, and it turns out to be not the case. So, and science, and the whole point, in some sense, I think of what you're getting at, is that science gives us tools to try and overcome our natural tendency to be overconfident.
Yes, yes, and in fact, actually, it's interesting that we tend to be overconfident at the top end and a little bit underconfident at the bottom end. So, sometimes our gut feelings, when we really feel like we don't know, sometimes our gut feelings are not bad. So that really we should have 65% confidence, not 50% could be right, could be wrong. On something. But these are all
That's
things that
interesting.
apparently people can be calibrated. They can be better trained at understanding that a little better. And then, of course, we try to develop all sorts of statistical techniques to make it easier to just come up with numbers with just algorithms without having
We'll,
to make
we'll
a
talk.
guess.
We'll talk about orders of magnitude, order of understanding, which of course is. I wrote a whole book about it on my physics book in some sense, but yeah, that we've developed tools to try and get some confidence, even when we don't know very much, but at least a set of tools that anyone can use to at least get from saying I have no idea to saying, well, maybe it's around here. And I think that's really, and we'll get there. I think you do a great job in the book talking about that. But the next chapter is about signal versus noise, and it leads us to the question of looking of the examples of seeing patterns that weren't there. And let me, and so the, and I think it's important to realize that, as you say, that signal is something you're looking for, and noise is something that gets in the way. But that's sometimes a very subjective thing. One person's signal could be another person's noise,
Right,
and
right.
and the best example I know, I can give two examples, both of which involved a Nobel Prize, one of which was yours. Um, my friend Frank Wilczek won the Nobel Prize for developing a theory of the strong interaction with colleagues, and it's called quantum chromodynamics. And then you talk about the discovery of the Higgs later on, and he always is amused by the fact that the predictions that led them to win the Nobel Prize are now the noise of because you can use their theory to calculate it, so that the noise you want to get rid of if you're looking for the Higgs particle.
Right, right.
Similarly, the discovery of that the universe is accelerating, the supernova, is important. But now, in some sense, we use that as a background to try and look for deviations from that to try and find something new. And so signal and noise is very subjective, but nevertheless, the ability to distinguish signal from noise and know when you're actually seeing a signal that exists instead of one that you want to exist is important. And in the book, you give an example of your own from Pulsar. So why don't you just talk about that a little bit, and then I want to talk about another example. Okay, talk about pulsars. Your experience
So,
as a young person.
yeah, so the Pulsar one is supposed to show you a case in which, and it was, I was reviewing a story in which it's so clear that random noise can mimic what looks like a very clear signal. And in this particular case, we were hunting in the remnants of a exploding star, a supernova. That was one of the few that was close enough that you could actually go and see them by eye. In fact, this was in the
One of them
southern
since
hemisphere.
since Kepler, maybe, or somewhere like that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's like the first in 300 years, right? Something
Yeah.
like that. And so we rushed down to the southern hemisphere where it was visible, and started to see whether we could hunt using infrared light into the cloud of debris and find. We thought there could be the birth of a new pulsating star. They're called pulsars, and
A neutron star that spins and produces basically a beam. That's a
exactly,
pulsar.
and
Yeah.
every time it goes past you, you see a bright light. But it could be thousands of times per second. These things are very fast. So you do this, with electronics to try and find it. And we, surprisingly enough, found something that looked like a really interesting example of a pulsar. And it was doing a kind of odd drifting in that frequency, that 1,000 times per second. It was like almost 2,000, and it was sort of slowing down in a sort of randomish looking way, which could happen. These things can be slowing, but we realized that actually, if you're going to make that measurement, you have to take into account the fact that things will look like they're slowing more or less, depending on whether you're moving towards it or away from it. This is the famous, Doppler effect, when you hear car horn that sounds high when it's coming towards you and low when it goes past you, away from you. And so we had to make sure that we weren't seeing having a Doppler effect that was confusing this particular drifting frequency. And in particular, when the Earth is spinning, in its axis, you'll be moving towards it when sometime and away from it the other time of day. And as we go around the sun, there's also a change in whether you're moving towards it or away from it. And so we had to correct for those, and we took those out. And shockingly, when we took those two effects out, what had been sort of a random looking drift turned into a perfect sine wave. I mean, it looked almost too good to be true, and that shocked us, and it made us think, wow, that's what you would get if there was a planet orbiting around this pulsar, and it was slightly tugging it to and fro. Years later, that's how people actually found exoplanets.
Yes.
But that was the first time that we thought maybe we saw a planet. So we rushed to publish a paper in Nature about this. And then we went back down the next time next season when that particular spot in the sky was visible as it came out from behind the sun, over the course of the year. And we started looking for it again to see whether it had slowed down more. And because pulsars do slow down, and what was going on. And we couldn't find it at first. And then we found it, and then it went away. And we started getting a little suspicious about what was going on. And then we realized that we found it every time a instrument across the other side of the telescope dome was on. And apparently it was no pulsar. It was just a radio interference from this other instrument that was leaking radio waves. Weirdly enough, in this absolutely perfect form, where if you happen to correct that random drift that it happened to have for the Earth's motion, this is completely random, you end up getting a perfect sine wave. Now, that seems really unfair. I mean, that the world would trick you that way. But it definitely reminds us that we will see perfect sine waves if something is going to appear, and they can be formed randomly, just like getting a whole bunch of heads in a row when you flip coins can happen randomly. And we learned our lesson. We had to retract the paper, and we sent a note to Nature and retracted it. For years, all my years afterwards, I was that much more aware that just because you see something that has got to be real doesn't mean it's necessarily real. That you have to.
You burned it. It was a great experience for you. Yeah, and it was a good experience of how science is done because it's also honest. Hey, we thought this was the case. You know what? We checked, and we'll get to that. The whole point of checking and why you check, and it wasn't the case. And the fact you retracted it, that's good science, not bad science. That's good science. And by the way, I won't spend time now, but when I was reading the book, I think I figured out why your instrument would give you the sine wave, why you think it did when you extract out we have. So
That
I'll
was
give you
fun.
my theory. I think I worked it out. So
Well, good.
anyway,
Good.
but that's a different thing as a theorist.
Okay.
But I now want to turn to another case, which I'll say frankly, by the way, I want to ask you this question, but if you want to later on remove it from our discussion, we can. But I was intrigued by this, and the result that you were obviously when you then discovered the universe is accelerating, that was another thing that's too good to be true, and you had to worry about a lot about whether it was wrong or not. But that's something that's an area where actually I have experience. You and I have had experience together. I vividly remember my 3 weeks or 4 weeks at Berkeley labs when I was going in 1995 or six, when I was going around saying, you know what, I think there's a cosmological
Well,
constant. And I
yeah.
remember you coming up to me after my seminar and saying, we are going to prove you wrong. We're doing the experiment and we're going to prove you wrong. Um, and and of course later you proved us right, but the more important thing is, and I want to ask you about this if you don't mind me asking you about this, is first you did prove me wrong. In 1997 your group came up with a result which said that it wasn't there, and then later on came up with a result that said it was. And I think if you don't mind going through that, I want to know what was the change
Yeah.
and why were you willing to make it, and if you don't mind chatting about it, do you
No,
mind?
no, of course.
Mhm.
The very first time that we had just enough data to begin to actually make a measurement of what we thought was slowing of the expansion of the universe was in '97.
Mhm.
And we had, I'm trying to remember now, it was five particularly good supernova, and maybe seven altogether,
Uh-huh.
if I remember correctly, it was something like that.
Yeah.
And um, and we said, okay, already at that point, we were getting to the point where we developed a technique that was finding batches and batches of supernova. So we were already up to like 25 or 30, and we were, and then by the time we actually did the final analysis, we had 42 supernova altogether. But with those first, five or seven, as a starting point, we thought let's test all the steps. Let's make sure that we can go all the way from this measurement of an exploding star's brightening and fading away, all the way to a measurement of how that tells you about the expansion history of the universe from those few supernova. And we went through the entire paper to show how the techniques work. What we found was a big error bar, as we knew we would. We knew we were going to need at least like 30 supernova to make a real useful measurement. But already the first one looked suggestive because it was centered around the what you would expect if the universe had no cosmological constant, if it was
Mhm.
actually
Mhm.
slowing it appropriately. Um, and uh, and it had big error bars, and it had even bigger systematic error bars. But we said, this sure looks like we're going to come in with a result that would prove you wrong in terms of the possibility of a cosmological constant. Um, I'm glad that at the end of the paper we did say something like, however, the error bars are still big. We still have another 25 or 30, whatever was in the can at the point. We will be able to give you a more definitive answer coming up. So that was the starting point. And then, of course, when we did the full analysis, the not only did the error bars dramatically shrink, as they should when you have a lot more supernova, but they also shifted over to where it was, and that was why we were really struck at the beginning of just the following year, when we had this new plot, and we thought, wow, something must be wrong. It's we're getting an answer that doesn't make much sense unless you happen to be Lawrence Krauss. Um, and and so we knew that we were going to have to do a lot of work checking every one of the steps, and figuring out because we just put the whole thing together, and we need to make sure that everyone was calibrated well, and the more we did, the more it didn't go away, and the more actually things sharpened up. And that was when we started to believe it over the course of probably 7 or 8 months of analysis before we started to believe that you were right. At the end of the day. So that was that's the fast version. There's one extra element of the story which I like to say sometimes, which is that going back afterwards, years later, I went back to look at, could I at all understand, whether it was just random that the center happened to be, where it was, or was there anything else going on? And I've come to the conclusion since then that one of the supernova would have pulled things a little bit the other way, but we analyzed it and analyzed it until it didn't. Now,
Ah,
it didn't. I don't think by itself it wouldn't have changed the whole story.
yeah,
It
it would
just
just broaden the uncertainty to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have broadened the
Mm.
uncertainties a little bit, and it would have probably moved the center a little bit
Yeah,
away,
but it
from.
would still have overlapped with 0, which would have been your preference, and then it yeah.
No, exactly. And so I don't think it would have changed how we would have said things much. But in retrospect, I looked at it, and this was right after I had done an analysis of one of our rival teams' data, and
Yeah.
I had discovered that they had done some serious mistakes. This is some Hubble Space Telescope data, and
Yeah.
I had found that they had done some serious mistake in their analysis that actually should have shifted the result dramatically. And
Uh-huh.
I thought, well, why didn't it? And it turned out that it didn't because it was exactly canceled by a change in the Hubble Space Telescope's calibration over
Mm.
that came out around that time, and it
Oh.
made me suspicious. And I thought, well, you know what? I bet that they analyzed things up to the point that they got the answer they expected, and then they stopped analyzing. And I was feeling very smug about this
Yeah.
until I went back and I looked at this other one, and I realized, you know what? I think we did the same thing on that one supernova out of that small set of 5 to 7 that we had. And from then on, I don't believe any results that we do unless we do them in this technique where you blind your
Yeah.
analysis, that you don't let yourself know what the answer is until you've uh, done all the checks and you agree that you're going to publish with what you've got, and then you allow yourself to see the answer. Because I don't trust myself to not do that, to get that right. When have we decided that we've done enough analysis? Let's publish, and not to be affected by what I expect or would like the answer to be.
Well, actually, I'm glad I asked the question. 'Cause that's again another great example of how science is done. Not just individual scientists and our tendency to stop asking questions when we get what we want, but also the fact that, hey, you look at data and uncertainties really mean something. It may be centered on the value you want, but there's a wide uncertainty. And when you continue to experiment and you reduce the error bars, it could become different. That's what uncertainty means. Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure, I'd like it to be zero, but it could be not zero. And you know what? It's not zero. And
And
or
we, we
an
all had,
election is going to go a certain way, and it goes a different way than you thought, no matter what this.
and we all had a dramatic example that occurred to us, in the elections in which we thought the polls were saying
Yeah,
one
exactly.
thing, but what they really were saying is that there's a 1/3 chance that it could go the other way,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we got the 1/3 chance.
Yeah, people don't realize that 70% is 6, 7%. That's I was going in exactly the same direction. Means
Yeah,
one out of three times you have an election, you're going to get wrong. But before we leave, I just want to mention because I think it hadn't occurred to me until since we brought up our Joe Taylor, a wonderful scientist who did win the Nobel Prize for discovering gravitational waves as a result of pulsars. But it's worthwhile pointing out that the techniques he did to discover the gravitational waves were exactly the ones you tried to do to remove the noise. An amazing analysis, not just to remove that, because he was trying to look at things at 1 part in 10 to the 15th or so, but removing the motion of the Earth around the sun and the sun around the galaxy and every single thing that could get in the way of the actual signal. And it was only by doing that he was able to uncover this incredibly small signal.
that's right.
Um, will you move on from that to searching again for patterns are not there, which in some sense we talked about, but the fact that if you saw random, and you give a great example in the book, which I like, of two random patterns, one of which most people will say is random, and it's not the one that really is, because no one thinks a random pattern is going to have 7 heads in a row, of course, but of course it's guaranteed to if you keep hitting the dice enough times, you'll get or a point enough times, you'll get 7 heads in a row, and that's going to happen. It's not going to happen a lot, and unfortunately, most people who gamble think when they've gotten 6 that they're more likely to get the 7th, and then that's where they lose all their money. But it does hit at one of these evolutionary psychology things that we all want to believe for. We all want to look for patterns, and I think one of the arguments is that we do it because it's helped save our lives. That in the early times, in the savannah, when our ancient ancestors were hominids were developing, the trees could rustle, and you could assume that's nothing, or it's a lion, and the ones who maybe assumed there was something there, even if there wasn't, were the ones who survived. So we tend to have this teleology. We always look for purpose and something there when it may not be there, and we find significance in something that may not be significant. And I think we all have this experience of anything that happens to us is suddenly significant, even if it's just an accident. And it's really hard to convince someone that example of the Lourdes case is another example. But if something's an accident, if it seems weird, you think it should be significant. And scientists, and I know many examples, I've seen it in my own work, where experimentalists find something so interesting they're not willing to realize it's an accident,
Yeah,
and then sometimes publish something without doing the adequate checks. Feynman was big in terms of often finding out their errors, and he often gave the example. Um, you have a dream one night that your friend is gonna break their leg, and then they wake up and you find out they broke their arm, and you think, wow, but you don't remember the 10,000 dreams you had, all these other times that were nonsense. So we have gotten a technique, and you talked about it with the Higgs example, to overcome that besides the blind search, which we'll talk about in a second, to overcome that effort to find patterns that aren't there or look for things. And I thought your discussion of the Higgs was good. Do you mind giving it?
Oh, just that we were pointing out that when you ask a question of data, if you have a very specific question you ask, it's reasonably easy to then try to figure out, well, how often would the answer come out to be what you see if it was just random noise? But what you don't always recognize is the fact that you may be asking lots and lots of different uh, versions of the same question, and each one there's a chance that you could have gotten random noise creating it. So the physicists learned over time that they had to basically divide down the probability that something was right based on how many questions they asked, because each one could be another source of a random hit, a random pattern. So that's called the look elsewhere effect by the physicists. It's called multiple comparisons and multiple questions by other fields who come across it. But it's a key thing that we in our current world you have to be aware of, because we're getting so many opportunities to be asked questions of many questions of the same data, because so many people are on the internet looking at the same results. And so you will end up getting many times a random what looks like a pattern, just because so many people have asked something of the same data. And this what didn't used to be the case. It's been harder to do that. So that's become even more of an issue in our current world.
And okay, and then another issue that's big in our current world and relevant, perhaps more obviously, well, relevant in physics, but in other areas that you talk about. And I like the fact that, of course, the book eventually moves into, because the point is to talk about not just science, but how to apply it in society, and you begin to see it more and more in the book. But the question of false positives versus false negatives, um, you can be wrong a number of different ways. You can
Yes.
be wrong in saying there's something there that isn't there, or you can be wrong by saying there isn't there something when there is, and they both can have consequences, and sometimes one was more important than the other. I like that discussion. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, and of course, in some sense, we always have to choose our thresholds of, for this particular purpose, are we happier being wrong? Some of the, a higher probability of being wrong by missing a signal, or are we happy? Is it more important to us that we catch a signal, even if that means we'll get some false alarms? And we all had a lot of that experience of having to make that decision in the recent pandemic,
Yeah.
where you had to make all the time decide, am I going to be absolutely sure before I go to something that nobody has COVID 19, or is it more important that I in this particular case don't get triggered by a false alarm?
And and I think it's, it depends on case by case, and and I think, the interesting thing, I guess, as an experimentalist, I'll ask you this, because it's, I think it's far worse. The sense I get as a scientist that it's, you feel worse when people have a false positive, when they claim something is there that isn't there, than when they don't see something that is there. But if you're the scientist, what you're always worrying about is missing something that is there and having someone else scoop you. So I think there's these if you're
This,
actually doing the work,
this
you're more worried about the false negatives. But actually, if you're publishing, you've got to worry more about the false positives, right?
Yeah, there's this very natural tension, and you can see it sort of like in job talks, when somebody's going to give a talk at a university, and if they don't have an exciting result, then they may not get a job. But if they have an exciting result that turns out to be wrong, they could lose the job. It's
Yeah, so but there is that tendency to want to do it, and I think, again, learning how to balance those things is part of the science, and learning, not just learning psychologically, but using tools that have been discovered by others, by the tools of science, for how to avoid those things is the key point. It's not as if
and
we internally can cure ourselves of our natural tendencies. We just say, well, there's a methodology and this methodology works, so let's use that methodology.
Absolutely. And also, it comes along with a natural way to communicate the degree of certainty and uncertainty, so that you can be, if your job is to be completely as honest as possible and to point out all the things that could be wrong, then everybody can then decide, do they accept this or not? And if it turns out to be wrong, it's fair game. That that you've been honest, and I think that's the thing that people really look for.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's a next thing you talk about, which I really enjoyed and thought is scientific optimism, which I think
Ah,
is really important. Scientists are innately optimistic in a way, and one reason for that is simple, and it's true of anyone. I think, in a different sense. If you're going to spend 20 years of your life on something, you've got to have a reason to think it's going to work. And so scientists are innately optimistic um, that what they're going to work on is going to work, even when there may be no evidence of it. And so I was amused that you point out, well, we just talked to you about how you can fool yourself, but you kind of need to fool yourself a little bit if you're going to be motivated. I found that fascinating. You want to expand on that, and we'll talk a little bit
Yeah,
more
yeah.
about it
No,
in different
I think
contexts.
one of the things that is a danger of teaching a course like this is that you can get everybody to be complete cynics, and skeptics of
Yeah,
everything, to the point that it's just you say, well, how do I believe this? That could be wrong, that could be wrong, etc. But that's not, in some sense, it's like driving a car. I think we give the metaphor, driving a car with just brakes to make sure you don't make a mistake.
yeah.
But you can't drive a car with just brakes. You need an accelerator pedal, and the accelerator pedal, I think one of the accelerator pedals for science is this. It's a culture of willingness to believe that you can solve a problem long enough to solve a problem. And generally, I think we can make error of sticking to a problem too long that's just not ready to be solved. But it's much more common that humans make the other error of they get frustrated after the first couple hours on a problem, let alone the first couple months on a problem. And a really good, interesting problem, worth its salt, could take years. And science has
Or
had to
decades. Yeah.
culture that allows people to stick to something for years.
Absolutely, and being willing to do that. That's right, because the hard problems are not easy to solve. One of my I think I said in my physics and Star Trek book that the biggest mistake they make is every time there's a problem on the Enterprise, it's solved within 2 hours. The engineers can solve it, and that's one of the people get this. And it was, I think, frankly, a big problem with the pandemic that people thought, well, science is there. Why can't we solve the problem in a month? When in fact, if you don't know what the disease is, you don't know what you have to. The fact that you could even do it within a year is frankly remarkable.
I mean, that
But
was
people get
amazing. Yeah.
attuned from TV to thinking, well, the scientists should be able to solve this and know the answer. And part of the problem was, unfortunately, I think the scientists who got up and said, we know the answer when we don't. It takes time, and hard problems are
Yeah.
difficult to solve. And the pandemic is we still don't understand a lot about it. And I thought it was a wonderful chance for the public to learn how science worked. And instead, it turned out to be often quite the opposite, a sense that science fails and not really being the good teaching lesson it could have been.
No,
Um,
I agree that and I feel sympathy for the people who are in the position of having to communicate this. That
yeah,
I think they were really scared that they would do it wrong and that people would die, right?
yeah.
And it's so easy, in second, for me to sit back afterwards and say,
In
oh, what they
hindsight,
really should have said was this or
yeah,
that. But now that we've done this once, I hope that next time around, that we really do try to take advantage of this whole style of thinking, that we're able to explain to people that this isn't like a situation where we know the answer and we just do it and we're done. This is much more like playing a sports game, a
yeah,
football game against the virus.
yeah,
And it's you don't come up with a play and then you just use that play for the rest of the game, for the rest of the
yeah,
2 hours or 3 hours of the game, right? You are going to have to watch what the virus is doing. You're going to have to try and come up with another play. You're going to see what is it doing. Is it changing? Is it coming up with a different strategy? And then we'll change our strategy. And we don't know what its strategies are, and we're going to have to try to figure them out, because then we're going to have to come up with and people, I think, would understand that metaphor, and they would
yeah,
recognize the fact that they should stay tuned. That they want to be there when the coach tells them our next play this week is going to be this.
yeah,
And they want to be in the game. They don't want to be just basing it on whatever the first strategy was from the very first huddle. So I think that could have been done, but I understand why it wasn't, and I'm
incredible
hoping
pressures.
next time around we'll be able to take advantage of that knowledge and do better.
I hope so. One always hopes that we can learn. And on the other hand, as Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot. Anyway, but there's two other reasons for optimism, which I don't want to leave for a moment, because you bring out one, which is the fact that science often enlarges the pie,
Yep.
as you point out, and there are lots of examples. But I remember, for example, when I was a kid, I was strongly influenced by a book called Limits to Growth, which basically said there are fundamental limits on population and food and everything else. And
Right.
based on extrapolating what was there, it was a perfectly good analysis. But often science changes the rules or changes what's possible. and therefore extrapolating into the future is sometimes a little difficult in that regard, because by being optimistic that you might be able to change the rules and might be able to do better at producing food, or better at curing diseases, or better at generating energy, you can change. So it's very dangerous to always extrapolate from the present. That sort of motivates that kind of optimism, and you pointed that out.
No, I think that is a key thing that that science offers that that people have not internalized often. That we have learned that things can change and things can be solved, that you may never have thought they could be, and that it's important to have that in mind so that you don't limit your options too early, and that you're open to the possibility, and in particular in places where you have different people's interests pitted against each other, and it often feels like everything's a zero sum game, and that if you win, I lose, and if that group is doing better, we're doing poorer. I mean, you even see it in the economics discussions of what's going on. When China is doing well, that
Yeah.
somehow that's bad for the United States, whereas in fact it's probably good for the United States. If China is doing well, and just we seem to have lost sight of the fact that that's one of the biggest lessons of history and of science. That often we end up being able to make something possible for everybody to do much, much better. And that it's not a question of you win, I lose.
Yeah, and that's great. And by changing the pie, it's always, if it's a zero sum game, then it's a zero sum game. But with science, it isn't always a zero sum game. You change, add variables. And I think an important example is climate. I read a book called The Physics of Climate Change, and I tried just to talk about the physics, not about policy, because I wanted to reach people who were naturally skeptical of some policies that people would suggest. But one of the things that I tried to end with, and I was influenced to some extent by a friend of mine, Dan Schrag, who's a climate scientist at Harvard, but is that it's natural to be doom and gloom, because if you make projections at the present time, it is pretty worrisome. But we need to realize that the real problem of climate change is probably not technological. That there's going to be technologies that are going to be developed to do things that we can't do now.
Yes.
The real problem is going to be political or sociological. But I have great faith. While I view climate problems as severe, and what can result as severe, and it's just basic physics to realize that those things can be severe. There's no politics involved. It's fundamental science. But we'll be able to develop technologies that are going to address some of the things that now seem really problematic. And I think that that's important to remember. Whenever, otherwise, it just seems like such a hopeless problem. We might as well just give up now.
I mean, I think one of the things that I've been so concerned about is that people are not recognizing how much capability they have, right? That we actually, I think, have learned even in just our own lifetimes how much we are able to change the game of feeding the planet and for that matter changing the climate. The fact that things that we do can have enough of a scale effect that they can change actual climate. It's clearly been a problem that we're all facing, but it also comes along with the fact that we actually have the capability. We have tools that are much more powerful than we would have thought. And the biggest problem we have, I think, is exactly what you're saying, is that we aren't getting people into that thoughtful discussion with each other about what do we want to do together, and how do we want to make things, what do we want to solve, and how do we want to make things work? If even we were a little bit more on that same page, and of course that's one of the whole points of writing this book. I was thinking, just being a little more on the same page gives us I think we would not be worried about many of these things. They would be tough, and we'd have to work hard at them. But I think we would have we have the capabilities now in a way that we never knew we did.
And that would give us the will, maybe, to do it, and the real will to realize that it's not a zero sum game, and it's not you win, I lose in when it comes to climate and addressing it. There's another. I'm continuing on this because I think there's another. I think these are valuable lessons. So I hope you don't mind if I dwell on some of the things you brought up. But uh, there's another aspect, which is that there's another reason to be optimistic, because, and I don't think you stressed it in the book, but I think it's important, is that not solving problems is also a good thing in science, but it's a good thing in business too. I created, when I was chair of a department, a program in physics entrepreneurship, which the head of our business school called an oxymoron, but it's not, because often if you're optimistic and you work hard, we used to tell our students, I remember in that program, that one of the things about physics is you learn how to solve problems when you don't know what the problem is. And namely, if you use it, it's like the techniques that you use as an experimentalist. You learn them and you may plug all the way to try and do an automated study of X, and it leads nowhere.
Yeah.
But that tool that you've used is going to help you solve another problem. So the
Yes.
optimism often causes you to work hard on something that later on helps you solve a problem you never even knew you were going to solve. And it's true in the business world as well.
No, it's a very good point, and which we did not actually get in the book. But you're
Yeah.
right. But I think this idea that so much of what we're doing is training ourselves so that we'll be able to do something else.
Yeah, exactly. It's rarely a waste of time to work hard on something. I mean, rarely. There's almost always a benefit, even if you have no idea what the benefit is going to be. And of course, that's the great serendipity of science, the great
No, exactly,
discovery.
and it's one of the reasons why I think it's so powerful to have um, people motivated by the excitement of learning something about the world. That you bring people in to do something that it's never going to be. I don't think it'll ever be practical for us to really have a deep understanding of the Big Bang. It's. I mean, maybe it'll tell us something deep about the physics that we can then use for something else. But to first order, it's a reasonable bet that most of it won't ever show up in our world. And yet, it ends up being one of the best ways to focus people's minds and invent all sorts of tools that then really are practically useful in the world. Tools both for analysis, but also tools of sensors and techniques. And so it's just something that will focus the brains of a lot of smart people because they're excited by it is as valuable as necessarily the practical problem that they might be focused on.
Well, and often the great solution to practical problems comes from people who are just interested in the puzzle. And
Exactly.
the history of from antibiotics to even transistors. I mean, if someone gave Pell Labs a thing and said, in 1940s, make better computers, they'd have wheels and pulleys, and instead of transistors. There's so many examples of it, of the
Right.
importance of.
I love also thinking about how completely impractical general relativity or what about clocks traveling near the speed of light. It just doesn't seem like that ever was something that we're going to have to worry about, and yet GPS is
Exactly. And I remember writing about that. Yeah, GPS. I try and give an example of how esoteric things could be. And I remember, I don't know whether you ever took a course at Harvard. He was a colleague of mine when I was at Harvard, one of my favorite ones, from Ed Purcell, one of the most lovely scientists I've ever known, won the Nobel Prize for developing what is now nuclear magnetic resonance. And he was wonderful.
Yeah.
Just
No,
so many ways.
we had him for two courses. Absolutely.
He was
Yeah.
just, as a colleague, he inspired me. Every time I went to work, I would say I want to, and I talked to him. I'd say I want to grow up and be a physicist, even though I
Yeah.
already was. But one of the things he said at NMR when they developed that, he said, "Well, it's fascinating, but it'll never be useful for anything." But the difference is, and I think I'm glad you're honest about it. I tell people that one of my great joys is that nothing I've ever worked on has any practical significance whatsoever. And people say, "Well, you don't know that," and it's true. But I'm pretty darn sure that nothing except for our understanding of ourselves and how we got here, which I happen to think is incredibly important, is never going to make a better toaster or car or anything like that. But although the experimental techniques are different, they can have good side effects. But once again, I think their scientists fall in the trap. I remember when the SSC, when the super collider was being built, they fell in the trap of trying to justify it by its spin-offs. And I don't think you should ever do that. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing. And yeah, anytime you spend $10 billion on any technology, it's going to have great spin-offs. But that should never be the chief justification for doing it. Well,
Yeah.
the next thing you talk about, and maybe we'll dwell on and quickly do some of the others before we get to values, which I want to get to, is probably for me personally the most important aspect of understanding the world, which is this orders of understanding and Fermi problems. It's a central piece for me as a scientist, and as I say, my book Fear of Physics is really about that. Is that science has given us this amazing set of tools to take what seem to be insurmountable problems and not only solve them, but understand them in ways that you couldn't before. How many piano tuners are there in Chicago? If I go and ask someone on the street, they're going to say, "How the hell should I know?" But Fermi gave us away, and we give away. And you don't just to discuss that, which I think is interesting, and we can talk about it, but also orders of understanding. To first Well, why don't you talk about orders of understanding? Why should I? You talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think that one of the things that makes us feel much more capable of taking on really complex, difficult problems as scientists is that we've learned that most problems that we've come across, or at least many problems we've come across, end up having many, many contributing factors, but the factors aren't all equally important. And that if you can learn which ones are really the operative factors, it's often greatly simplifying the problem, and it allows you to take on what otherwise would just be a mess, and really hard to do. So one of the first things that physicists will very typically do is try to identify what are the main contributing factors, and then really do quick analyses of, as you say, these back of the envelope, how many piano tuners in Chicago style analyses of how big are each of these in their effect, how important are they, and in some sense, you would like people who are doing national budgets to do that as well. You want them to be saying, well, let's deal with the big parts first before we start dealing with big arguments over these little tiny things that will make no difference to the overall effect. And that's, I think, one of the trainings that help scientists feel a little bit more powerful, a little more capable. And when we've taught it to the students and let them play around with doing quick estimates of things, we've had people come up afterwards and say, that really made you feel like that you can do things in the world.
You feel superhuman. It's a magic. It's a superhuman power. It seems like magic when I do it to people, and it really is. But that's one of the areas where in physics we're fortunate because you can often isolate the important things. One of the problems of, say, a science like biology and medicine, I mean, what doctors are trying to do is exactly that, but it's often much harder to do, to find out what are the key factors. Sometimes you have to work for years and years and years and years. It's
Yeah.
not obvious, and similarly, often in society, it's the case too.
Absolutely, and I mean, climate change is a very complex thing. But it does, as another example, but it usually pays to at least ask this question early on, because some problems that otherwise look completely hopeless are amenable, to this. Even ones that that are social issues in public life, that you know some of them are a complete mess where there's many, many, many contributing factors that you can't get behind. But sometimes, surprisingly, just one or two factors, if you can get at them, they provide you levers to help fix things.
I was going to say, interesting enough, while this is fundamental to our ability to do things, I found it to be perhaps the hardest thing to teach students, especially graduate students. And the reason is the mistake we make in teaching. We give students problems and problem sets as undergraduates that they're guaranteed to be, well, in principle, they're guaranteed to be able to solve,
Yeah,
right? And to some extent, we give them PhD problems that they're more or less guaranteed to solve. But in the
right,
real world, it isn't that way. And in order to solve any problem in the real world, usually in physics as well as everyone else, you have to know what to throw out.
right, right.
And throwing out information is I found one of the hardest things that, when I watch students go from being undergraduate students to fully functioning graduate students, the
Yeah,
transition is sometimes in being willing to know, okay, I want to be able to solve the problem. It may not be the problem, that I thought I could solve because there's so many things, but being willing to throw out the stuff that is going to get in my way. And I found that's probably the hardest thing to get people. No one wants to throw out information. And even though it's irrelevant, it's really interesting. I don't know if you found that in training
yeah.
students.
I think that's right, and I think that the terminology of teaching people to be looking for what things are negligible is a ends up being a big deal, right? Trying to say this thing here is just not going to be important, and don't waste your time on it when there's other things that are important.
And often, and I will get to this in a second when we come to values, but it's also in the real world, it's also worth realizing that what you'd call first order problems, the ones that you really have to take into account for one person may not be the same as for another. What really matters, even if people are looking at the same, what you might think is the same underlying problem, what really matters for one person may be really not matter for another. And it's not as if one is right and one is wrong. Yeah,
Right.
always. And you have to realize that. And I think it's something that scientists too often don't appreciate when they work with government. We'll get there in a bit. But the Fermi thing, the fact that you can and I challenge the listeners to determine how many piano tuners are in Chicago. But it does something else, which I've always been amazed of. I grew up before calculators. When I go to a grocery store and buy something, I know roughly what my bill is going to be, and I'm always amazed. And I remember the cashiers are always amazed when you can estimate something better than they can. But more importantly, it helps you from making ridiculous errors that a cashier, you have 50 items and someone typed in something wrong in the cash register and they go, okay, it's $1.50. And you go, you want to think about that again? Because people
Right.
trust what they see so much. Whereas if they just did an estimate, well, we had 20 items and the average cost per item is $2 or $4 or $6, it'll be, 80, 120, 160. And it's interesting how, once again, that is a wonderful technique that people can use to overcome often finding ridiculous things, but just by thinking about order of magnitude. And
Yep.
it's not trivial. I hope he won't mind me saying this. One of your esteemed colleagues was a student of mine, Martin White, who you may know. And
Yes.
Martin is a remarkable scientist, a great student, and he's amazingly fast at computing and doing numerical computations. And I was, most of my students who are really good, and I've been fortunate to have a bunch of good students. I see them. I've just been there to guide them a little bit, maybe provide one useful thing, but they're going to do fine regardless. And the only thing I think I taught Martin was that he would do these amazingly intense computer calculations, come back the next day with the result, and I'd say it doesn't seem right. And he'd say, why? And I'd say, well, let's think about what you think the answer might be. And so the only and I saw over the course of his career, and he was a very successful scientist, just simply being able to anticipate whether the results of a really detailed calculation are right by stepping back and doing the simple things. I like to do the simple things. He liked to do the complicated things, but it's very important.
Absolutely, and I also think this is another example of something that's become even more important in a web-based internet world where you will be given all sorts of claimed numbers all the time, and you'll just look them up and you'll find them. But you need some way to do a quick sanity check to say, this doesn't make sense, because otherwise it's just too easy for people to produce numbers and never check them themselves, or to be, intentionally making something up. And you need to be armed with the ability to say that doesn't make sense. There just aren't. There couldn't be that many cars on the road. Let alone this much oil being used or whatever it would be.
Or it is. I remember once getting in trouble pointing out, the average American is less likely to be killed by a terrorist than many other things, and other people got mad at me. But if you work it out, and I think it's a training. It's a useful training, and it's a fun training. I think people don't realize, because it's numbers, that it's actually fun. And the one of my mantras came from the former publisher of the New York Times. He said, "I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out." But I generally find that when I read scientific papers too. It's not just going on the internet.
Yeah.
If you read something and you think this doesn't jibe with everything I know,
Yeah.
it's quite likely that it isn't true. Now, it doesn't mean it isn't. You have to check it. But
Yeah.
if your experience, and especially your quantitative experience, says, hey, if someone says this were the best 4 years that ever happened, say they're running for president again, and you say, well, let me think about that. Was it really the best 4 years? Anyway, it's always worth asking yourself some simple questions to see if you're being deceived. And
Absolutely.
also, as we'll skip, we'll zoom through the last bit, but which is really about how you can get things wrong, how you can deceive yourself, and particular the notion of biases, that the bias that you had, that we all have, but the bias that that the cosmological constant is zero or not zero, the bias that you give lots of examples in the book, the bias that people had. Feynman gives a variety of examples of this, of measurements of the electron mass or the electron charge, and you can see what happens is the first experiment's here, and all the other experiments are around there, and then it slowly changes, and every next experiment is somehow biased by the experiment before, because they don't want to be too far away from it. So it never made that big jump, but slowly asymptotically approached the right value. And that bias is very, very important. And you spend a significant amount of time talking about debiasing. And so I want to turn it over to you again.
Yeah, no, and I think that one of the things I like about that particular story is the fact that it was a great example where we are still discovering new ways that we go wrong,
Yeah.
and that this isn't like we've finished developing science and we're done.
Yeah.
It's that
Yeah.
we will constantly be hunting and discovering. There's another subtle way, and for example, some new ways are more likely to happen as technology changes. So the fact that we no longer tend to do our analyses by adding 12 numbers together and then dividing by 12 and getting an average. Typically, we're putting things into this complex computer program and letting it run for a while, and
Mm.
that it leads to different kinds of errors that we have to watch out for. Like that now we depend on debugging our computer programs. When do you stop debugging? Maybe you stop debugging when you get an answer that you're not embarrassed to have your graduate student go and report at the next conference.
Yeah.
That's not a good reason to stop debugging. And we've started to see it when we reanalyze that data that you're describing of these masses of fundamental particles, and you realize that you saw that weird pattern appearing, and it led to the particle physicists beginning, and then us cosmologists starting to as well do that technique I was talking about, where you blind yourself to the result when you're doing the analysis, so that you can't decide to stop debugging your computer program just because you got an answer you were hoping to get, or that you thought wasn't embarrassing. Um, and and so I think that I love the fact that it's only been the last 15, 20 years that's
Yeah.
becoming a standard, but it's becoming enough of a standard that in fields that have taken this on seriously, you just don't publish a result unless you've done some effective blinding. It hasn't caught on to the rest of the science world yet, and I'd like it to. But these things are developments, and we have to constantly be looking for them and trying to figure out how do we do better. And this is one of the ones I really love to see in action.
It is very important, and it's in action of the again. I'll quote Feynman because I love quoting Feynman, but his point was it's really important and probably the hardest part, and implicit it's implicit in what you're talking about here is that as he says, every time you come up with a result, you work really hard to see if it's correct, but you should work equally hard to see it's wrong. And that's the thing. We should work just as hard to prove ourselves wrong. And we
Yeah,
never do that. It's the
and
hardest thing to do.
exactly. And maybe you should be even working harder to prove that you're wrong than to prove that you're right, because it's because you'll already do the first two
Yeah.
easily. The second one is the one that you're going to have to really push yourself.
You give us in terms of confirmation bias and blind analysis. This confirmation bias being we tend to try and confirm the things we like, how blind analysis can get around it. You talk about a recent result which is really important and one that is relevant to my own interest. But I like the story about LIGO. So why don't you talk about what LIGO did, because I think it's really important, and explain
So
what LIGO is, I guess, if you.
Yeah, so LIGO was this amazing project, but took like 40 years
Yeah,
to
almost
get
40 years.
the techniques to work well enough to look for these tiny changes of distances as a gravitational wave goes past us. And so these huge tunnels with where they're bouncing light back and forth between mirrors. And what they were afraid of is that this false positive and false negative thing was going to hit them, that they would be so careful not to take false alarms that they wouldn't see real signals when they happened, or they would be just too accepting of coincidences of what looked like a gravitational wave signal, and then they would be fooled into thinking they've seen one that wasn't there. So they did something which is very much in the spirit of blind analysis, which is they deputized a small team to make fake data sets that they would inject into the stream that they were analyzing, and they were designed to make sure that people knew that there was some of the results that would be very difficult to find, that actually was a real signal, and if they can't find it, which was because it was intentionally faked to be a real signal, if they can't find it, then they know that they're not actually being sensitive enough, that they're not actually doing the job correctly. And then similarly, they can be checked the other way, that they're not just finding things when they didn't have the signal in. So they did this, and then they set it up so that the teams would be go through the entire analysis chain, ideally, and maybe even write the paper before they would go and check to see whether or not it was a fake signal or real. And I gather that it didn't quite get used the way they were originally intended, just by the ways things happened in terms of what was turned on and what was turned off at the right moment. But they did have the experience of going through a lot of the analysis and then something turning out to be a fake. And
Yeah, they had that happen at least once. Yeah.
and so that was a good exercise. And then the time when they actually finally found the first signal, it was so powerful. A signal was so strong that I think everybody's reaction in the team was, "I'm sure this has got to be the fake." I mean, it just was, it was just too obvious.
Yeah, they
And of
all
course,
thought it was the
it was
fake.
real. Yeah.
And but they'd gone through it before, and when it wasn't a fake. And one of the things you don't I love the story because it's amazing. It was such a gold-plated signal. If you had to imagine the kind of signal they were looking for, that's it. That's enough to make you, think it's not true. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
remind me. I'll tell you in a second. I'll tell you another time that happened. But what you don't mention is the other reason that is it's the serendipity of that is that not only did that signal look so beautiful that they were convinced, many people thought, well, it's the team coming in, but the other thing that was remarkable about it was it occurred 3 hours after they turned on the
Right, exactly.
apparatus. So you wouldn't
Exactly. It's just
expect it.
the thing
You
on.
thought they were going to wait 6 months, and the
Yeah,
first signal comes in 3 hours. So there's all these reasons to believe it's not true. The
yeah.
fact that it came in 3 hours after and I like to say it's amazing because it came from something 1.2 billion light years away, I think. And to think that signal traveled for 1.2 billion years, if the experiment had been turned on 3 hours later, they never would have seen it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
It's
no,
science is
it's
amazing.
remarkable. Yeah. So, so,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
sometimes randomness, hurts you. Like when we thought we seen a pulsar. Sometimes it's on your side, giving
It's
you the nicest signal in the first three
exactly.
hours of your running.
And I remember, by the way, after you guys discovered, observed that the universe was indeed expanding, there was an energy of empty space. I must have gotten interviewed at some point, and I said the first time I didn't believe it is when they saw it, because it
Right,
just seemed too good to be true. I mean,
right,
I've been arguing it was there, and then when you saw it, I thought, nah, it can't be true.
right.
Anyway, uh, the last part of the book is an important question because it involves groups, as we're talking politics, and I want to spend a few minutes on it. And it involves the wisdom of crowds and the madness of crowds. One of my favorite books is Charles Mackay's book, "The Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds," from I think 1850 or something. It's a telling book to read because it's worthwhile reading now because it's worth realizing that in many ways we haven't gone forward. But you point out that there, however, is a wisdom of crowds, and there's two aspects to the wisdom, and one of them but one of them, which seems magical, is not magical at all. It's just statistics. So why don't you talk about it?
So this was also a early paper where somebody was pointing out that I forget who was the
It was
remember.
1916 or something you referred to it. I forget what.
Yeah.
Yeah, but wasn't McKay was 1850? But there's someone else who pointed out the effect that you're talking about. And I didn't know of that person until I read it in the book. I don't know where it is now, but
Yeah, yeah, I forget now. But anyway, they were pointing out that if you ask a bunch of people, let's say, to estimate the weight of a bull in a affair, that people don't get it right. They're wrong, but on average, they average in on something that's remarkably close to the right answer. And this doesn't always happen. You need it to be something where there's uh, a a healthy estimate that people might have had, but they will be way off in all directions, and that cancels. Now, this is what we call the wisdom of crowds, and you can see it in other situations where you need lots of partial information, and if you put that partial information together, you actually get some a better result than if you just asked a couple people something. And the question is, how do you get that effect and not get the other effect, which is herd thinking? That if you ask the first person in a room a question and then go around the table, people tend to kind of not want to disagree with the either the most charismatic person in the room or the person who went before them, and so people sort of lock in on something, and you'll get people believing nonsense just because they're all just trying to match each other.
Absolutely.
And so, how do you get one, not the other? And so that was sort of the beginning of this discussion. Um, and what is it that you're trying to achieve when you get a group of people together? Of course, what you want is the best of their collective wisdoms, not the worst of their collective madness. Um, and what we start seeing is that there are a number of different techniques that people have been using over the years and trying out over the years that give you more of one than the other, and it was worth everybody being aware of them and having them available to them. So that was what led to this chapter.
Yeah. The first thing is, I mean, the first thing is just a law of large numbers, that if you get a lot of people, without a independently and without a dog in the fight, estimating something, it'll converge and you'll get some big and some small. But when they do communicate, then you have to worry about these things. And I found, you talk about how can you get the best from groups, and I won't go into it, but I found it very interesting because I did a podcast with someone named Charles Duhigg, who's a best-selling book, basically about how to communicate. And it's examples of people who can effectively lead a group to a good decision. And interestingly enough, many of the things you talk about here are exactly the same things that he talks about from experience that have worked. And I think it's really interesting. So you really aren't, and people will follow the most charismatic person. And they're famous. One of your colleagues, I was surprised I didn't see it here, or maybe I missed it. The famous psychological experiment that's been performed, a few where they have a group of people in a room in a plant, and the plant says, "Oh, I see that." The person in the plant, "Oh, I see that," and then all these other people will start to see it, and
Yeah,
it happens all the time because people, don't want to deviate from the herd. And
yeah.
that takes us to really the real world, perhaps the most, which is how can we communicate, how can we work effectively, and how can the scientific tools be integrated into things like politics. And the last part talks about facts versus values, and it's really important to know the difference. There are, I think, what's his name, senator from New York, Moynihan, used to say, you're allowed to have your own opinions but not your own facts. But it's not just that their opinions and facts. Values matter, and and to discount them is to discount human experience. So why don't you talk about a little bit about it?
I mean, I think early on we started realizing that there's a tendency to think, let's just get everybody to think rationally, and then everything will be fine. But what's missing in that statement is that it's most decision making that you have to make, and policies and things like that, actually are driven a huge amount by the fears and the goals and the ambitions and the values
Yeah.
that are in play, and that's the real reason that you're making a decision, because there's something you're trying to reach or there's something you're trying to avoid. It's not that you got there because you want to exercise your rationality. That's not why you're there to make a decision. And so in the end of the day, if you don't come up with any principled, systematic ways to weave the values and the goals and the fears in with the rationality, the part that you'll end up leaving behind is the rationality, not the fears and the values and the goals.
Yeah.
And as we see, often in the world. And so we thought that if you take seriously the rationality, you have to take seriously how do you combine it with the values and the fears and the goals. And so
It,
that was why we became very interested in what techniques have people developed that try to do that. Now, to begin with, first of all, you might just want to help people train themselves a little bit on recognizing which parts of the decision are the values and which parts are the facts, because not that you won't need to discuss both of them, it's just you need to discuss them in slightly different ways. The facts, you really want to discuss using all these techniques of evidence and rationality that we're describing, and probabilistic thinking, et cetera. The values, you want people to, sometimes people think that if it's a values question, there's no point in having a discussion because that's your value, this is my value. But in fact, that's not really the way we work. I mean, we tend to have multiple values, each of us, that we're constantly trying to prioritize among each other in a given decision-making process. And if somebody points out to us that actually we share the same values, it's just that in this particular case, I prioritize this one. In another case, I've actually prioritized the other one that that person's prioritizing. That's actually helpful because it gives you a chance to stop and think, okay, I shouldn't be dogmatic about this value because actually I gave it a lower ranking for another problem, and I should be listening to what the other person is saying, and we should try to think together about why do we want to prioritize one or another in this particular case. So there is some interesting conversation to have there, and you can learn a lot in talking about values. It's just that it's a different conversation than the conversation you have when you are doing facts, and you need to do both, in these problems.
Oh, very well said. I think that's great. And there's one aspect of it that you didn't discuss a little bit that I think is complementary, and I learned it from my wife, who worked for the Australian government, helping interface between politicians and scientists. And what she learned was that, and what she taught me was that the real problems is neither side understands what's important to the other side. The politicians don't understand what the scientists are interested in. But what stopped me, and she's just walking in here, so she's going to hear me talking about her. But what is equally important was that the scientists seem to think that the scientific issues are the only ones that matter, where
Right.
it's not. And it's not as if it's an illusion that economics is important. For example, in climate change, it may be clear that doing X will, and if you really want to reduce climate change in some ways, do X. But for a politician and for people, it might require a change, which to them is more worrisome. And you
Yeah.
can't discount that and say that's not important. The
Yeah.
scientists themselves just didn't realize where the politicians were coming from. They're saying this is important. It's going to affect our economic policies, and it's going to determine whether our government is reelected or not. And you can't just say, well, I'm going to discount that, because the minute you do, you're not going to have an impact on influencing the politicians. By If you say, well, what you think is important isn't important, the politicians are going to stop listening to you. So she'd help train the scientists to make them realize what the politicians were interested in, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Realizing that people's values, when it comes to the real world, even on the same set of facts, can disagree on what action should be because of different values. And it's not as if those values can all be discounted. And unless you recognize what they are, you're going to have no useful dialogue.
Absolutely. No, and that's this sense in which if you aren't engaging with the values and the goals and the fears, um, you're not really taking seriously the decision making process. You're just doing this isolated uh, you rational calculation, but that's not part of the decision process that ends up being effective. And I thought that one of the things that was perhaps most optimistic and inspiring to realize is that um, people often feel like in our current world there's not really much interesting discussion and debate, and that people aren't able to make progress together. We happen to be living in a particularly polarized moment. Clearly. On the other hand, what I thought very inspiring is that if you take a random sample of the population, and this technique called deliberative polling, and people call it sometimes civic assemblies. If you use a truly random sample of the population who are really representative of all the demographics and all the different interests that are there, that group is much better at having a conversation and thinking through problems than their leaders today
Yeah.
often are. And that was really interesting to read about and to hear about. And that those groups now, if you just leave them alone and don't give them any information, of course, you end up with a slightly useless conversation. But if you empower them by having them have panels of experts available to them while they're trying to deliberate and while they're trying to figure out problems, so they can keep, whenever they get stuck, they can ask a panel who may disagree with each other, but they can ask them, okay, what's the evidence and what the stories, what are the issues here? They can make much more progress than I think people are aware. And so that was, for me, a very encouraging part of the story, that it's probably important for people to recognize that if they can get that effect, which people sometimes describe, in juries,
Yeah.
they can see that juries do much better than you would expect from just a random group of
Mm,
12 people
mm,
who you don't think of as being that smart about this legal issue.
yeah.
Um, and so the more we can get that effect, and it has a lot of authority because it is the true representative sample of the public, even more so than the particular elected officials are at any given moment.
Well, that's nice to have that little bit of optimism, and it's important, because a book like this, or the things we talk about, are useful if they are useful to society in general, but they're also only useful if we realize how societies work, and that that's not everything is just pure science in the sense of pure facts, and that's why society people say, why aren't scientists leaders of government? Because it wouldn't do any better than anyone else. I think societies are not scientific. Life is not scientific in that sense, although the tools of science can make life much, much better, which I think is the point of your book. And I want to come to close to the end now here with a challenge that you give out in your penultimate chapter. And I want to give you this. I want to give you that challenge. The proposition is we may be the first generations in human history that could reasonably aim to build a lasting world in which every person can thrive. So you say that the proposition is debatable, but I'm now going to give you that challenge and say, argue for or against the motion.
So for me, the idea that this is even a possibility is remarkable, right? I mean, I don't think when I was a child, I don't think I could have, even with a straight face, had that conversation, because I think we were all aware of the the limits of growth and and all these Malthusian problems that we were going to just outstrip our planet and not have the resources, etc. But we've learned that we actually have grown dramatically since we were kids in a population, and yet the fraction of the population that's starving, goes to bed hungry every night, is has dropped dramatically. And so things that we never thought would be possible, I think, are possible. And we've even now come to the point that the next major extinction caused by a asteroid hitting the Earth may not happen, because we would actually be able to nudge it out of the course before it hit us. There are things that you just couldn't imagine that we would have any effect on, including climate, that we actually could, just like now we're doing damage to our climate, we could actually control our climate, so that we didn't have to go through these ice ages, and in the future that would have otherwise been impossible to have our civilization survive through.
Yeah.
There's so much more that we have available to us now than ever before. And the part of the story, that, when I say that it's conceivable, that's, I think, really important for people to recognize, that we live in a time where, on the one hand, it's very scary. Everybody's very aware of all these different things that could go wrong, that we could destroy our planets or our civilization. But it's not only the worst of times, it's also the best of times. We also are living at a time where, in principle, if we could just pull ourselves past all the bickering, and the lying and the cheating, whatever, to try to maintain power, or get power, or preserve from one to the other. If we could manage to be just a little bit more working together to solve things, I think we have a reasonable chance that this could be an amazing generation to live in. That we would actually be working together to build a planet where everybody was fed and clothed and housed and educated, and we'd be worrying about things like, well, what are they going to do with their time if we've got all these robots and AI doing other things that we used to think we would be doing? How is it that we want to have a meaningful lives? I mean, that would be a fascinating challenge if people felt like that was where they want to spend their time, and not be spending their time trying to fight to control some political domain. And in some sense, it's a bizarre moment to live in, because we live in a time where either one of those could be the way we spend our time. And right now we're seeing a little bit the worst of it, where we all feel a little bit like, mostly what we're doing is trying to stave off disaster, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think this could be the period in which we're actually taking advantage of the fact that that there's a exciting activity that we could be doing that we've never had before. The option of, let's all work to build something that we would just feel proud to be living in this planet, and so that was the sense of that statement. And it's no guarantee that we'll do it, and they'll get it right. It's just that we should be aware that we're making that choice, in one way or the other. And if we can help each other make the better choice, it would be a particularly fun period for us all to be living in.
Well, that's a lovely and optimistic response, and the future is terrifying, but it's terrifying partly because it's exciting and because we can change it. And I think that's a wonderfully upbeat way to end. But I'm actually going to give you the last word in a different way. I just gave you the last word impromptu, but I'll give you the last word by reading something in the last page of your book, which I think is important. We said, we hope to leave the reader with a realistic but exhilarating sense that with a collective push, we just might be able to turn this corner into the third millennium with a new collaborative approach to our problems and opportunities from the small to the global. And I applaud you for trying to do that. And it's been a real pleasure to chat with you. One of the things I really just was thinking about that I really enjoy about doing these things is I take people I've talked to many times, but I don't think you and I had talked that long and substantively at one occasion before. And it's been a true pleasure, Saul. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'm sure our listeners will. But thank you very, very much, and I hope you had a good time.
No, absolutely. I'm really glad you're doing this. It seems like a really important way to get these stories and these ideas out.
Well, thank you. Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at originsproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at originsproject.org. Thank you.